ancient sites often reveal something more unsettling than their appearance suggests. Beneath collapsed walls and weathered surfaces, there are traces of decisions that no longer make sense. Structures abandoned without clear reason, spaces designed for purposes that remain undefined, and modifications layered over time as if the original intent had been lost or changed. In some locations, construction begins with one logic and ends with another, leaving behind a sequence that feels interrupted rather than completed. What remains is not just architecture, but a record of actions without a clear explanation. The mystery is not how these places were built, but why their stories appear incomplete. Until those missing connections are understood, ancient ruins remain less like finished works and more like fragments of a process we can no longer fully reconstruct. Rows of stone rise silently from the Sardinian earth, stretching across a landscape that feels too ordered to be natural, yet too ancient to be understood. And at first glance it looks like a cemetery, but the longer you observe it, the less it behaves like one, because cemeteries do not normally require dozens of standing stones aligned across open terrain, forming patterns that seem to follow rules no one can fully decode. And yet here at Pranu Muttedu, that is exactly what we find. A burial ground that looks disturbingly like a system. A place where intention is visible but meaning is missing, and where every stone seems to belong to a design that no longer speaks its original language. Located near the modern town of Goni in Sardinia, Pranu Muttedu was not uncovered in a single dramatic moment, like many famous archaeological discoveries, but instead revealed itself slowly through decades of systematic surveys and excavations conducted throughout the 20th century, where what initially appeared to be scattered stones embedded in the landscape gradually emerged as a structured archaeological complex. As researchers identified more than 60 menhirs, many standing between 1 and 3 meters tall, alongside multiple dolmens constructed from massive stone slabs, forming burial chambers that date back to approximately 4000 to 3000 BCE within the Neolithic period, and at this early stage the interpretation appeared straightforward, a prehistoric necropolis. Yet as excavations expanded and mapping techniques improved, a critical inconsistency began to emerge, because the stones were not randomly placed as one would expect in a simple burial field, but instead followed patterns, orientations, and spatial relationships that suggested deliberate organization. With each new excavation phase, the site became increasingly complex and difficult to categorize, as early investigations focused on funerary structures, where dolmens revealed fragmented human remains, basic grave goods including pottery fragments and stone tools, and clear signs of repeated use across generations, indicating that the site functioned as a burial ground over an extended period of time. Yet as archaeologists expanded their surveys and began to analyze the spatial distribution of the menhirs, a more structured pattern started to appear, because these standing stones were not merely marking individual graves, but instead formed long linear alignments stretching across the terrain, some extending for dozens of meters, while others created clustered formations that hinted at geometric planning, and in certain areas the stones appeared to maintain consistent directional orientation, which could not easily be explained by terrain or convenience. And by the late 20th century, this accumulation of evidence forced researchers to reconsider the entire nature of the site, leading to the realization that Pranu Muttedu was not simply a cemetery, but a designed landscape with rules that remain only partially understood. The people responsible for constructing Pranu Muttedu lived in a time before metal tools, before written language, and before formalized systems of mathematics. And yet they achieved a level of organization that appears strikingly advanced for its context, as they were able to quarry and transport stones weighing hundreds of kilograms, sometimes approaching 1 or 2 metric tons, move them across uneven terrain without the aid of wheeled transport, and erect them vertically with sufficient stability to withstand erosion, weathering, and the passage of thousands of years. And more importantly, they arrange these stones across distances in ways that strongly suggest intentional spatial planning, because placing a single menhir upright requires knowledge of leverage, balance, and soil stability. But aligning dozens of them in consistent orientations implies something more systematic, possibly a method of measurement using ropes, pacing systems, or visual sightlines, creating a paradox that appears repeatedly in prehistoric archaeology, where the technological simplicity of the tools stands in contrast with the complexity and precision of the final result, producing outcomes that feel less accidental and more engineered. Among all the unresolved aspects of Pranu Muttedu, the question of astronomical alignment remains one of the most debated and scientifically intriguing, as preliminary observations suggest that many of the stone rows follow a general east-west orientation, aligning broadly with the path of the sun as it rises and sets. A directional pattern that held symbolic and practical importance in numerous ancient cultures, often representing cycles of life, death, and renewal. Yet the consistency observed across multiple alignments suggests that this may extend beyond symbolic placement, and when compared with other prehistoric sites, the implications become even more significant. Because at Stonehenge, the primary axis aligns with remarkable precision to the summer solstice sunrise, an event that occurs only once each year, while at Carnac stones in France, more than 3,000 standing stones are arranged in long, parallel rows that some researchers believe may correspond to lunar or solar cycles. And although Pranu Muttedu does not exhibit the same degree of precision, the repeated directional consistency suggests that its builders may have been responding to similar observational patterns. Yet the lack of exact calibration introduces ambiguity, because the alignments are too structured to be dismissed as random, but not precise enough to confirm the existence of a fully developed astronomical observatory, leaving open the possibility that the builders were engaging in observational practices that were empirical rather than mathematical, or, alternatively, that they were replicating inherited traditions whose original purpose was only partially understood, raising the possibility that the site represents not a single coherent system, but the accumulation of knowledge passed down and gradually transformed over generations. The presence of dolmens confirms that Pranu Muttedu functioned at least in part as a burial ground, but the scale, organization, and integration of the menhirs suggest that its purpose extended beyond simple interment, indicating that the site may have served multiple overlapping roles, including a space for communal rituals, seasonal gatherings, and possibly symbolic interactions with cosmological ideas, because in many prehistoric belief systems, death was not viewed as a final endpoint, but rather as a transition within a larger cosmic cycle, and aligning the dead with the movement of the sun or other celestial phenomena may have represented an attempt to integrate human existence into the broader structure of the universe, suggesting that the site functioned not only as a resting place for the dead, but also as a stage for the living to engage with concepts of time, continuity, and existence, where ritual, observation, and memory intersected within a carefully structured environment. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis indicate that Pranu Muttedu was not constructed in a single unified phase, but instead developed gradually over centuries, with evidence suggesting continuous or repeated use from the early Neolithic onward, introducing a significant layer of complexity, because it implies that multiple generations contributed to the formation of the site, potentially modifying, expanding, or reinterpreting its original layout. And this pattern is consistent with what has been observed at sites like Göbekli Tepe, where later communities interacted with monumental structures that may have already lost their original meaning. And if a similar process occurred at Pranu Muttedu, then some of the alignments and structures present today may represent a form of inherited knowledge, preserved through repetition but gradually detached from its initial purpose, resulting in a system that continued to exist even as its underlying logic became increasingly obscure. Today, Pranu Muttedu remains partially understood but fundamentally unresolved, as modern archaeological methods allow researchers to map the site with high precision, analyze soil composition, date organic materials, and reconstruct aspects of its use. Yet these tools have not been able to fully explain why the site was constructed in the way it was, because the evidence points simultaneously toward burial practices, ritual activity, and spatial organization, without providing a single unifying explanation that accounts for all observed features, leaving behind a structured mystery in which intention is evident but interpretation remains incomplete, a place where patterns are visible but their meaning continues to resist translation. Do you think Pranu Muttedu is just a simple burial ground, or a system we still don't fully understand? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Once stood along one of the most important routes in Anatolia, positioned between political power and economic movement, connected to the vast network that linked Constantinople with the interior of Asia Minor. It was not destroyed by fire, not buried by ash, and not erased by invasion. There is no dramatic layer of destruction, no collapsed walls frozen in catastrophe, no historical record describing its end. Instead, Juliopolis simply faded out of existence, a disappearance so gradual that it left behind no defining moment. Then, centuries later, it vanished again, this time beneath water. Today, most of what remains lies submerged under the reservoir created by the Surya Dam, invisible, inaccessible, and largely unstudied. Unlike Pompeii, where volcanic ash preserved a moment in time with extraordinary clarity and allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the final hours of its inhabitants, Juliopolis offers no such snapshot. Its disappearance is not an event that can be dated or reconstructed with precision. It is a silence, and that silence is the mystery. The story of Juliopolis did not begin with a dramatic excavation, but with fragments scattered across a landscape that gave no immediate indication of its past importance. Inscriptions carved into stone, isolated ruins partially buried beneath soil, and references embedded in Roman administrative records gradually allowed archaeologists to piece together its identity. The site, located near modern Ankara within the ancient region of Galatia, was eventually recognized as a municipium, a status that implies a degree of administrative organization and integration into the Roman state. Epigraphic evidence, particularly funerary inscriptions and dedicatory texts, confirm not only the name of the city but also aspects of its civic life. Coins recovered from the area, dated roughly between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, provided further confirmation of economic activity and participation in imperial trade systems. These coins, often bearing imperial imagery and inscriptions, indicate that Juliopolis was not isolated, but functioned within the broader monetary and commercial networks of the Roman world. Yet despite this evidence, the city remained almost entirely absent from historical narratives. It was not prominently mentioned by historians, not associated with major political events, and not known for monumental architecture. It existed, but it did so quietly, and this absence of written attention would later become one of the most significant clues in understanding its fate. Systematic archaeological work, particularly during periods when water levels in the reservoir dropped, revealed a necropolis of remarkable scale. offering one of the most tangible insights into the life and structure of the city. Hundreds of graves were uncovered, many containing pottery vessels, coins, jewelry, and personal items that reflect both daily life and ritual practices. The diversity and quality of these grave goods suggest a society with clear social stratification, where differences in wealth and status were expressed, even in death. Scientific analysis of ceramics has shown that some items originated from distant production centers, indicating long-distance trade connections that extended far beyond the immediate region. This aligns with what is known about Roman trade networks, where goods could travel hundreds or even thousands of kilometers across the empire. The necropolis also provides demographic insights, suggesting a stable population that may have reached several thousand inhabitants at its peak, based on burial density and spatial distribution. Beyond the cemetery, traces of roads, structural foundations, and fragments of urban infrastructure have been identified, reinforcing the interpretation of Juliopolis as a functioning and organized settlement rather than a peripheral outpost. However, this is where the contradiction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. In comparable urban centers such as Ephesus, archaeological layers reveal continuous cycles of destruction, rebuilding, and expansion over centuries, reflecting adaptation to economic, political, and environmental changes. In Juliopolis, this pattern appears incomplete, as if development ceased abruptly without the expected transitional phases. The city does not show clear evidence of gradual decline, nor does it exhibit signs of sudden catastrophic destruction. Instead, it appears to have stopped, leaving behind a fragmented record that resists conventional interpretation. This leads directly to the most significant and unresolved question: why did an important city disappear? Juliopolis was not geographically isolated or economically insignificant. Its position along a major transit route connecting inland Anatolia to Constantinople placed it within one of the most active corridors of movement in the Roman and later Byzantine world. Roman infrastructure was designed to maintain stability and efficiency, with roads facilitating trade, communication, and military logistics. Settlements along these routes typically thrived, benefiting from constant movement and exchange. One possible explanation for the city's disappearance is economic decline, resulting from shifts in trade routes. Historical evidence shows that when trade patterns change, cities can lose relevance and gradually depopulate. However, such processes usually leave identifiable traces, including reduced construction activity, repurposing of buildings, and signs of adaptation to changing conditions. In Juliopolis, these indicators are not clearly present in the archaeological record. Another hypothesis involves environmental change, such as alterations in water availability, soil degradation, or localized climate shifts. In other ancient cities, including Angkor, advanced scientific methods such as satellite imaging and sediment analysis have revealed the collapse of complex hydraulic systems as a key factor in urban decline. No comparable evidence has yet been identified for Juliopolis, leaving this theory plausible but unconfirmed. A third possibility relates to administrative and political restructuring within the Roman and Byzantine systems. Cities could rise or fall depending on their assigned roles within provincial governance, and a loss of administrative status could lead to rapid decline. Yet such changes are typically documented in historical records, and the near-total absence of written references to the city's decline makes this explanation difficult to confirm. What remains is a pattern without a clearly identifiable cause. A strategically located, economically integrated city with evidence of social complexity that disappears without leaving behind a definitive explanation. In archaeology, where even small changes often produce measurable traces, this level of absence is both rare and deeply puzzling. In the 20th century, the construction of the Saria Dam introduced a second layer of disappearance, transforming the site from an archaeological mystery into a submerged one. As the reservoir filled, the remaining structures of Juliopolis were gradually covered by water, effectively sealing much of the site beneath the surface. This process created a paradox. On one hand, underwater conditions can significantly slow the rate of deterioration, protecting structures from weathering, erosion, and human interference. This phenomenon has been observed in sites such as Heraklion, where statues, buildings, and artifacts have remained preserved for more than 1,000 years beneath the sea. On the other hand, submersion creates substantial barriers to research. The depth of the water, limited visibility, and technical challenges associated with underwater excavation restrict the ability of archaeologists to conduct systematic investigations. Unlike coastal underwater sites, where marine archaeology has advanced significantly, inland reservoirs like the one covering Juliopolis present unique logistical difficulties that have not been fully overcome. As a result, large portions of the city remain unmapped and unexplored, effectively locked away from detailed scientific analysis. We know the city is there, preserved in part by the very water that conceals it, but we do not yet know what information remains hidden within its submerged structures. What do you think caused the disappearance of Juliopolis? A slow, invisible collapse, a hidden environmental shift, or a factor we have not yet discovered? Along the northern coastline of Jamaica, carved not by human ambition but by water, time, and geological chance, lies a cave that presents a quiet contradiction. There are no towering monoliths here, no engineered symmetry, no artifacts of gold or stone tools, and yet inside Wogan Cavern there are markings, shapes, lines, and patterns that appear disturbingly intentional, not clear enough to be called writing, not precise enough to be confirmed as art, and not random enough to be dismissed as nature, making this not a mystery of advanced technology but something far more unsettling, a place defined by a single disturbing idea: evidence, without proof. Unlike major archaeological landmarks, Wogan Cavern was never the center of a large excavation campaign. Instead, entering academic awareness gradually through geological surveys of Jamaica's karst landscapes during the 20th century, where researchers were primarily focused on mapping limestone formations rather than uncovering human history. The cave itself formed through limestone dissolution, driven by slightly acidic rainwater over tens of thousands of years, a process that typically produces chaotic environments filled with irregular walls, unpredictable pathways, and surfaces shaped entirely by fluid erosion. Yet early observations began to note something unusual, as certain wall sections appeared smoother than expected, and some surfaces displayed linear features that did not align with known erosion patterns. Anomalies that were initially dismissed, since limestone caves often generate visual illusions through mineral streaks, pressure fractures, and water channels. But over time, it became clear that Wogan Cavern did not fully conform to these explanations, leaving behind subtle irregularities that resisted easy classification. Unlike sites such as Aktoon, Tunichil Muknal, and other Caribbean ritual caves, Wogan Cavern yielded almost nothing in terms of traditional archaeological evidence, with no stone tools, no pottery fragments, no human remains, and no charcoal deposits indicating fire use, an absence that is scientifically significant because even short-term human occupation typically leaves measurable traces such as micro-charcoal particles embedded in sediment layers, organic residues accumulating over time, or tool marks accompanying carved surfaces. Yet at Wogan Cavern, these indicators are either completely missing or too minimal to confirm sustained activity. creating a paradox in which the cave presents no physical evidence of habitation, while its walls suggest the possibility of interaction. A contradiction that defines the entire site and challenges conventional archaeological expectations. At the center of the debate are the markings themselves, appearing as shallow grooves etched into limestone surfaces, some forming straight or slightly curved lines, while others intersect to create geometric suggestions, such as angles, junctions, and shapes that resemble primitive symbols. Yet the core problem lies in the fact that these features exist in a threshold state between natural and artificial, forcing researchers to rely on comparison, geological analysis, and cognitive science to interpret them. When compared to confirmed carvings created by the Taino people across the Caribbean, a clear contrast emerges. As Taino petroglyphs found in regions such as Puerto Rico and Hispaniola typically display consistent line depths ranging from 1 to 3 millimeters, repeated symbolic motifs including faces, spirals, and anthropomorphic figures, and a clear intentionality in placement and spacing, whereas the markings in Wogan Cavern vary significantly in depth and clarity, lack consistent symbolic repetition, and often fade into surrounding rock irregularities, a statistical inconsistency that weakens the argument for deliberate carving, since repetition is one of the strongest indicators of human origin. In controlled archaeological studies, yet the geological explanation introduces its own complexity, because limestone under stress naturally develops fracture lines that can follow linear or curved paths, intersect at angles, and extend across surfaces in patterns that appear structured, while water erosion can further widen and smooth these fractures, making them resemble carved grooves. And laboratory models have demonstrated that fracture networks in limestone can produce angular intersections between 60 and 120 degrees, angles commonly associated with human design, creating a direct overlap between natural processes and human-like geometry. Layered onto this is the perceptual factor, known as pareidolia, where the human brain is predisposed to detect patterns in randomness, interpreting ambiguous stimuli as meaningful shapes, a phenomenon that becomes especially influential in archaeological contexts, where observers expect to find intentional markings, meaning that under low lighting conditions and uneven cave surfaces, the brain may actively construct symbols where none exist. Yet despite these explanations, some features resist dismissal as they appear too localized to be purely random, too isolated to belong to larger fracture systems, and positioned in visually accessible areas as if meant to be seen, creating an unresolved tension in which there is not enough evidence to confirm human origin, but also not enough randomness to fully ignore the possibility. The indigenous presence in Jamaica is generally dated to approximately 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, associated with the ancestors of the Taino, and if the markings within Wogan Cavern are indeed human-made, they would most likely fall within this time frame. Yet without organic material suitable for radiocarbon dating, no direct chronology can be established, leaving researchers with a critical gap in understanding where the cave may have been visited only briefly, leaving minimal trace, or the markings may predate known habitation patterns, or they may not be human at all, each possibility leading to a fundamentally different historical interpretation, none of which can currently be confirmed through available evidence. Wogan Cavern's coastal position makes it strategically significant, as caves near shorelines are commonly used as temporary shelters, ritual spaces, or navigation landmarks. Yet once again the expected archaeological evidence is missing, with no accumulation layers, no debris zones, and no repeated occupation signatures, suggesting that if humans did use this space, they did so lightly and almost invisibly, which introduces another contradiction, because the presence of markings implies intentional interaction, while the absence of material remains suggests minimal or transient use, raising a fundamental question of why markings would be left behind in a place that shows no other signs of human presence. What do you think these markings really are? Natural formations or traces of human intention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rising in Bosnia with a shape that appears too deliberate to ignore, its slopes descend at near uniform angles, its silhouette resembles a softened pyramid, and in certain exposures, its surface reveals flat, stacked stone layers that look disturbingly artificial. This is not a monument recognized by archaeology, not a protected site, not even a widely studied anomaly. And yet, Begića Glavica presents a problem that sits uncomfortably between geology and design, because the question is no longer whether nature can produce geometric forms. It can. The real question is, how precise does a natural structure have to be before it stops looking accidental? At what point does coincidence begin to resemble intention so closely that the distinction itself becomes unstable? Unlike most ancient sites, Begića Glavica was not discovered in a dramatic archaeological moment. It was always there, mapped, walked upon, ignored. Its presence too ordinary to demand explanation. Its elevation roughly 100 to 150 meters above surrounding terrain never attracted scientific urgency. Only in recent decades, with the spread of aerial photography, satellite mapping, and digital elevation modeling, did its geometry begin to stand out with unusual clarity. Observers started to notice that the hill's slopes seemed consistently angled, with inclinations estimated between 30 and 40 degrees across multiple faces. These values are not random. They fall within the same stability range used in human-built pyramidal structures, where gravity, load distribution, and erosion resistance are carefully balanced. This does not prove anything, but it introduces a statistical discomfort. Natural hills formed through erosion and sediment deposition typically exhibit irregular slope variation, shaped by wind direction, water flow, vegetation patterns, and tectonic disturbance. Yet Begića Glavica appears unusually restrained, as if governed by constraints that are not immediately visible. This recognition echoes earlier debates surrounding the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun, where similar claims of geometric intentionality triggered both global fascination and strong scientific skepticism. In that case, most geologists concluded that the structure was a natural hill shaped by geological processes, while critics argued that certain features remained insufficiently explained. Begića Glavica, however, has not undergone the same level of scrutiny. It exists in a quieter space, largely unexamined, which paradoxically makes it more intriguing. Without the noise of controversy, its anomalies stand on their own, unfiltered and unresolved. Preliminary surface surveys conducted in the area did not reveal artifacts, tools, or any cultural layers typically associated with human activity. There were no ceramics, no burial remains, no inscriptions, no signs of habitation. By standard archaeological logic, this absence is decisive. Large-scale human construction does not occur in isolation. It leaves behind a network of evidence: quarries, transport routes, worker settlements, ritual spaces. The complete lack of such indicators strongly favors a natural explanation. And yet, despite this absence, the geometry refuses to disappear. Digital terrain analysis suggests partial alignment with cardinal directions, though not with the extreme precision seen in known engineered structures. Deviations of several degrees exist, which are enough to argue against deliberate alignment, but small enough to complicate the idea of randomness. For comparison, the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north with an error of less than 0.1 degree, representing a level of precision that remains extraordinary even by modern standards. Begića Glavica does not reach this level, but it also does not behave like a typical eroded hill. It exists in a narrow band between order and chaos, where neither explanation fully dominates. As erosion and limited exploratory digging exposed deeper sections of the hill, a more tangible anomaly emerged. Beneath the surface, layers of flat stone slabs appeared, stacked in sequences that closely resemble construction courses. Individual slabs vary in size, but many fall within thickness ranges of approximately 5 to 15 centimeters, and several exhibit fracture patterns that create near-rectangular shapes. At first glance, the resemblance to masonry is difficult to ignore. The visual language of these formations, flat planes, repeating layers, consistent spacing, aligns with what is typically associated with human-built structures. However, geology offers a powerful counterargument. Sedimentary rock formations, especially limestone and sandstone, naturally develop in layered sequences as particles settle over long periods, sometimes spanning millions of years. Through lithification, these layers compress into solid rock, and under stress, they fracture along bedding planes, producing flat, stackable slabs. In certain environments, these processes can create formations that appear remarkably uniform, even engineered. Similar patterns can be observed in natural cliffs, canyon walls, and stepped terraces formed through chemical precipitation or erosion. The anomaly at Begića Glavica lies not in the existence of layers, but in their presentation. In some exposed sections, the layers are not purely horizontal but appear slightly angled, following a consistent directional gradient that mirrors the external slope of the hill. In engineered structures, such alignment would suggest intentional design for load distribution, ensuring structural stability under weight. In geological terms, this could be explained by tectonic tilting or post-depositional deformation. However, such tilting is rarely uniform across multiple exposed sections without accompanying signs of distortion, fragmentation, or irregular stress patterns. Here, the layers appear both tilted and orderly, a combination that is difficult to categorize definitively. This leads directly into the core mystery, the most controversial and scientifically unresolved aspect of Begića Glavica. Whether these layered stones are purely geological formations or the remnants of an unknown construction process. The geological explanation remains robust and grounded in established science. Stratification, lithification, and natural fracturing can collectively produce structures that mimic artificial forms, especially under stable environmental conditions. In this model, Begića Glavica is not unique. It is simply an example of how natural processes can create patterns that humans instinctively interpret as designed. Comparable formations exist in layered sandstone regions, basalt column structures, and limestone terraces, where repetition and geometry emerge without any human involvement. Yet, the architectural hypothesis persists, not because it is proven, but because certain observations resist easy dismissal. Some slabs display edge-like boundaries that appear sharper than typical erosion patterns would suggest. In localized areas, the stacking seems too orderly, with minimal variation in spacing and alignment. In certain sections, the orientation of the layers appears to follow the macrogeometry of the hill itself, as if the internal structure is reinforcing the external form. These details have led to comparisons with sites such as Puma Punku, where stone blocks exhibit machining-like precision, and Göbekli Tepe, where large-scale construction predates expected technological capabilities by thousands of years. The comparison is not direct, but conceptual. In each case, the observed outcome seems disproportionate to the assumed process behind it. At present, neither explanation fully resolves the evidence. If Begića Glavica is entirely natural, then it represents an extreme example of geological order emerging from chaotic processes, raising questions about how often such formations occur and why they are so rarely documented. If it is artificial, then it challenges fundamental assumptions about human history, particularly regarding the presence of advanced construction knowledge in contexts where no supporting evidence exists. This duality places the site in a rare scientific category, one that is explainable in theory but not completely accounted for in practice. The ambiguity becomes more significant when viewed in a broader global context. Sites such as Yonaguni Monument present underwater formations with right angles, flat plains, and step-like features that remain debated between natural and artificial origins. Similarly, Gunung Padang has been interpreted both as a natural volcanic hill and as a deeply layered structure, potentially modified by human activity. In each of these cases, the pattern repeats. Geometry suggests intention, geology provides plausible mechanisms, and the available evidence remains insufficient to close the debate. Begića Glavica fits into this pattern almost perfectly. With one crucial difference: it has not been studied extensively. There has been no comprehensive excavation, no deep core drilling to analyze subsurface structure, no high-resolution geophysical imaging to map internal composition. The absence of data naturally reinforces conservative interpretations, but it also leaves open questions that have never been properly tested. The strongest argument against any artificial interpretation remains the absence of cultural context. There are no settlement traces, no tools, no organic remains, no evidence of sustained human activity in the immediate area. Historically, large construction projects are inseparable from the societies that built them. They require labor, resources, organization, and purpose, all of which leave behind measurable traces. Begića Glavica stands alone, without this supporting framework, making the hypothesis of human construction extremely difficult to defend within current archaeological standards. At an altitude of over 5,000 meters in the remote reaches of the Himalayas, a small glacial lake appears unremarkable for most of the year. Frozen, isolated, and inaccessible, it blends into a landscape shaped by ice and silence. But when the snow melts, the surface reveals something that should not exist in such numbers or in such a place. Hundreds of human skeletons scattered along the edges of the water, preserved by cold and time. The problem is not simply that these people died here. The problem is that they did not die together, did not come from the same place, and yet appear to have met the same end. Roopkund Lake is not a single mystery. It is a pattern of events repeating across centuries without a clear explanation. The modern story begins in 1942, when a British forest ranger, patrolling the region during the late colonial period of India, came across a disturbing sight. As the ice receded, human bones began to emerge across the lake bed and surrounding slopes. Initial assumptions were shaped by the context of the time. With the Second World War underway, officials speculated that these might be the remains of Japanese soldiers who had attempted an incursion through the mountains. However, closer inspection quickly dismantled this theory. The skeletal remains showed clear signs of age far beyond a few decades. No modern weapons, uniforms, or equipment were found. Instead, artifacts such as wooden tools, leather footwear, iron spearheads, and rings suggested a much older origin. What began as a wartime curiosity immediately transformed into an archaeological anomaly. By the 1950s and 60s, systematic examinations of the bones began. Anthropologists noted that many of the skeletons were remarkably well preserved due to the freezing conditions, allowing for detailed study. One of the most striking findings was the pattern of injuries. A large proportion of skulls displayed circular fractures, consistent with blunt force trauma delivered from above. These were not random breaks caused by erosion or animal activity. The injuries were concentrated on the top of the skull, with minimal damage to other parts of the body. This distribution ruled out close combat or interpersonal violence. Instead, it suggested a sudden, external force acting vertically. Based on these observations, researchers proposed a hypothesis grounded in environmental physics. At high altitudes, hailstorms can produce ice projectiles with diameters exceeding 5 centimeters and impact velocities sufficient to fracture bone. If a group of individuals were caught in an exposed area without shelter, repeated impacts could cause fatal head injuries within minutes. This explanation aligned with both the injury patterns and the lack of defensive wounds. However, it did not explain who these people were, why they were there, or why so many died in the same location. In the early 2000s, advances in radiocarbon dating provided the first reliable timeline. Initial tests suggested that a significant portion of the remains dated to approximately the 9th century. This placed the event more than 1,000 years before the modern discovery. The implication was clear. These individuals were not linked to any recent historical conflict, but to a much older, undocumented event. The number of individuals estimated between 200 and 800 indicated that this was not a small group. It was a large, organized movement of people. Further analysis of clothing fragments and artifacts revealed diversity within the group. Some individuals wore simple, practical garments consistent with local populations. Others were associated with more elaborate items, including ornaments and decorated objects. This suggested a mixed group, possibly including both common travelers and individuals of higher social status. One hypothesis proposed that they were part of a pilgrimage, possibly connected to ancient Himalayan religious practices. Yet, no written records from the period clearly describe such a large group meeting this fate in this location. In 2019, a comprehensive genetic study introduced a new layer of complexity. Using ancient DNA sequencing, researchers analyzed dozens of individuals from the site. The results fundamentally altered the understanding of Roopkund. Instead of a single group, the remains belonged to at least 2 distinct populations separated not only by geography, but also by time. One group was consistent with South Asian ancestry and dated to around the 8th to 10th centuries. This aligned with earlier radiocarbon findings and supported the pilgrimage hypothesis. However, a second group displayed genetic markers most closely associated with populations from the Eastern Mediterranean, including regions such as Greece and Crete. Even more surprising was the dating of this group. They appeared to have died roughly 1,000 years after the first group. This created a contradiction that current historical models struggle to resolve. There is no clear evidence of large-scale Mediterranean travel into this specific region of the Himalayas during that period. Nor is there an explanation for why these individuals would have followed a path leading to such an isolated and hazardous location. The presence of 2 unrelated groups, separated by centuries, yet ending up in the same lake, suggests that Roopkund is not the result of a single historical event. When all evidence is considered together, a pattern begins to emerge. Multiple groups from different regions and different centuries arrived at the same high-altitude lake. Each group appears to have died suddenly, with similar trauma concentrated on the skull. There is no evidence of long-term habitation, no signs of burial practices, and no indication that survivors remained to document the event. The deaths were abrupt and final. From a scientific perspective, the most consistent explanation remains extreme weather, specifically high-energy hailstorms. At elevations above 5,000 meters, atmospheric conditions can produce localized events of extraordinary intensity. Without modern forecasting or protective equipment, ancient travelers would have had no warning and no means of escape. Yet, this explanation raises its own questions. Why did multiple groups choose this route? Why were they exposed at precisely the same vulnerable location? And why does the pattern repeat across such long intervals? Roopkund Lake challenges the assumption that archaeological sites represent isolated events. Instead, it suggests the possibility of recurring environmental hazards interacting with human movement in ways that are not fully documented. The combination of radiocarbon dating, forensic analysis, and genetic data creates a layered narrative that does not resolve into a single conclusion. Each new discovery has added clarity to individual aspects, how they died, when they died, and where they came from, but has also expanded the scope of the mystery. If a single natural mechanism can produce identical outcomes across centuries, then Roopkund may represent a broader class of sites where environmental risk is underestimated or misunderstood. Alternatively, if there are missing historical connections, trade routes, undocumented migrations, or lost cultural practices, then the lake may be a fragment of a much larger story that has not yet been reconstructed. If multiple groups, separated by centuries and coming from entirely different regions, all ended up dying in the exact same way at the same location, do you think Roopkund is just a natural hazard repeated over time? Or are we missing a deeper pattern behind these events? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Built entirely from wood, this settlement should not have survived. It should have decayed, collapsed, and vanished into soil and memory long ago. And yet, beneath the waters of a Polish lake, archaeologists uncovered something impossible. A perfectly planned community, constructed over 2,500 years ago, where every house aligns, every street runs straight, and every structural element follows a hidden logic that feels engineered. No blueprints, no advanced tools, no written system of architecture. And still, Biskupin stands as one of the most precise prehistoric constructions ever discovered. The question is not what it is, the question is how it was ever possible. The story begins in the year 1933, when falling water levels in a lake near the village of Biskupin revealed rows of wooden posts emerging from the mud, something that at first looked like random debris, but quickly drew attention from researchers and locals alike. By 1934, systematic excavations began under Polish archaeologist Józef Kostrewski, and what they uncovered would go on to redefine the understanding of Iron Age Europe. Preserved in oxygen-poor, waterlogged conditions, thousands of wooden elements had survived entire sections of streets, house foundations, and defensive walls remained intact, something almost unheard of for organic material over such a long time span. Dendrochronological analysis later dated the construction to around 738 to 737 before the Common Era, with remarkable precision, suggesting that this was not a settlement built gradually over centuries, but one constructed in a single coordinated phase, a conclusion that alone was unusual. But what followed would prove far more unsettling. As excavations expanded, the layout of Biskupin began to reveal itself in increasingly precise detail, showing that the settlement covered roughly 2 hectares and was built on a small island, surrounded entirely by water, with a massive wooden fortification wall stretching over 400 meters in circumference, constructed from oak logs that were carefully interlocked and reinforced with earth. Inside, the pattern was unmistakable. 11 parallel streets, each approximately 3 meters wide, ran in straight lines across the settlement, and on either side of these streets stood rows of houses, over 100 in total, each measuring roughly 8 by 10 meters. A level of repetition that was striking, because these were not variations of a common style, but standardized units built with near-identical proportions. Each house shared the same internal structure, including a central hearth, a narrow entrance corridor, and living space arranged in a consistent layout, while even the spacing between buildings was uniform, suggesting not only planning but some form of measurement or calibration. This was not organic growth shaped by time and necessity. This was design executed with intent. Further digging revealed the engineering beneath the visible structures, showing that the entire settlement had been built on a foundation of timber laid across marshy ground, where thousands of wooden piles had been driven into the lake bed to form a stabilizing grid capable of supporting the weight above. On top of this, layers of timber beams were arranged in a crisscross pattern, distributing weight and preventing subsidence in a way that resembles, in principle, modern load distribution systems used in unstable soils. Yet here it was executed with tools that, by all known evidence, were limited to axes, adzes, and simple cutting implements. The streets themselves were paved with wooden planks laid side by side with minimal gaps, and in some preserved sections these planks show consistent width and thickness, suggesting controlled shaping rather than rough cutting, while their alignment remains straight over distances exceeding 100 meters. For comparison, many later medieval wooden roads built with iron tools and more advanced carpentry techniques show irregularities, warping, and inconsistent spacing over time. Yet Biskupin maintains a level of uniformity that challenges expectations. This is where the site becomes truly controversial, because the construction of Biskupin required the processing of an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 cubic meters of timber, translating to thousands of oak trees that had to be selected, cut, transported, shaped, and fitted into a cohesive system with remarkable consistency. The precision is the anomaly. Wooden beams fit tightly together without the use of nails. Joints appear intentional with surfaces flattened and aligned. And in several preserved sections, logs show parallel tool marks indicating controlled, repeated strokes rather than random chopping, while the edges of planks are straight enough to maintain continuous contact over long distances. Yet there is no evidence of saw technology at this scale, and sawing would produce different tool signatures than those observed, meaning that everything points to shaping by axe alone. Here lies the paradox. Shaping large volumes of timber to consistent dimensions using only axes would require extraordinary skill, time, and coordination, and experimental archaeology suggests that even skilled workers would struggle to maintain such uniformity across hundreds of components without a measuring system. There is no direct evidence of standardized measuring rods, no inscriptions, no templates that have been found, and yet the outcome behaves as if such systems existed. Even more puzzling is the moisture-resistant design, where the wood was laid in such a way that it remained stable in a wet environment for over 2 millennia, with anaerobic conditions preserving it, but structural integrity still depending entirely on initial placement, because misalignment or uneven load distribution would have led to rapid collapse, and yet it did not. To understand how unusual Biskupin is, it must be compared to other sites of similar age, because at Çatalhöyük houses were densely packed, but irregular in shape and orientation, reflecting organic growth over time, while at Skarabrae structures show consistency in form, but lack large-scale urban planning. And even at Mohenjo-Daro, where grid planning clearly exists, the society possessed advanced metallurgy. writing systems, and measurable standards that explain such organization. Biskupin, however, presents the planning without the expected technological context, placing it in a category where outcome and assumed capability do not align, creating a gap that remains difficult to reconcile. Artifacts recovered from the site paint a picture of daily life that appears, on the surface, relatively typical for an Iron Age community, including pottery, tools, animal bones, and traces of agriculture that suggest a society composed of farmers, herders, and craftspeople, rather than engineers or specialized architects. Nothing in the artifact record indicates advanced scientific knowledge or the existence of a distinct engineering class, and there are no elite structures, no monumental buildings, and no clear hierarchy reflected in the architecture. Yet the settlement itself behaves like the product of centralized planning, a contradiction that remains unresolved because the physical evidence suggests organization at a level not supported by the cultural artifacts. At some point, the entire settlement was destroyed by fire, as evidenced by charred wood layers found across multiple excavation zones, indicating a large-scale event rather than isolated incidents, after which Biskupin was abandoned entirely. There is no definitive evidence of warfare, such as mass graves or weapons embedded in defensive structures, nor is there clear evidence of ritual burning, leaving the cause of destruction uncertain, and what remains most puzzling is not the destruction itself but the lack of continuation, because a fully planned and highly organized settlement built with such precision simply disappears from the archaeological record without evolution into a larger system. Several explanations have been proposed, including the idea that Biskupin represents a uniquely organized tribal effort where a community briefly achieved a high level of coordination, while another theory suggests cultural influence from more advanced regions despite the lack of direct evidence linking them, and a more conservative interpretation argues that the apparent precision may be exaggerated due to reconstruction or preservation bias. However, detailed measurements taken during excavation contradict this skepticism, confirming that the consistency is real, which brings the discussion back to the central problem. How did a society with limited tools produce a settlement with such standardized, repeatable outcomes at scale? Do you think Biskupin was the result of an unusually organized community, or evidence of a level of knowledge we no longer understand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 6,000 years ago, on a small island in the Aegean Sea, someone carved a human figure so refined, so abstract, it would not look out of place in a modern art gallery. The proportions are deliberate, the posture is controlled, and the design is minimal, almost mathematical. And yet, according to everything we know about prehistoric societies, this object should not exist, because the people who made it were not supposed to think this way, not yet. And what makes this even more unsettling is not just the form itself, but the implication that the cognitive leap required to imagine such abstraction may have appeared far earlier than the archaeological record is prepared to accept. The story begins in the 1960s, when archaeologists began excavating the tiny island of Siagos, located between Paros and Antiparos in the Aegean, and what they uncovered was not a monumental temple or a lost city, but something far more unsettling. A Neolithic settlement dated to approximately 4,500 to 4,000 BCE, making it one of the earliest known organized communities in the Cyclades, a settlement that revealed evidence of structured living, early agriculture, and coordinated activity, and among pottery fragments, obsidian tools, and evidence of early seafaring. A single object stood out, a marble figurine unlike anything else found in that layer, and at first glance it seemed simple, almost primitive, but the more researchers examined it, the more it resisted classification, as if it did not belong to the cultural system that produced it. Subsequent excavations at Siagos revealed a surprisingly complex society for its time, with radiocarbon dating confirming continuous habitation over several centuries, while the presence of obsidian, sourced from the island of Melos over 50 kilometers away, indicated organized trade networks and maritime capability, suggesting that these people were not isolated but connected, capable of navigating open water and maintaining exchange systems. Yet despite these signs of sophistication, the artistic record remained sparse, with no large sculptural traditions, no gradual evolution of figurative forms, only isolated artifacts scattered across layers, and among them the figurine remained an anomaly. Unlike later works associated with the Cycladic civilization, which flourished nearly 1,000 years later, this object appeared without precedent, with no earlier prototypes, no intermediate stages, and no clear developmental trajectory, meaning it did not belong to a progression. It appeared fully formed, almost as if it had emerged from a system that left no trace behind. The figurine depicts a human form with folded arms, a slightly tilted head, and a streamlined body reduced to essential geometry, and its proportions suggest intentional design rather than symbolic approximation. Statistical comparisons with later Cycladic figurines show striking similarities, where the ratio of head to body length falls within a narrow and consistent range. The alignment of arms across the torso mirrors patterns seen a millennium later, and the overall symmetry suggests spatial awareness beyond purely functional carving, implying not just craftsmanship, but conceptual planning. And yet the chronological gap remains. How does a Neolithic society, operating with stone tools and limited material culture, produce a form that aligns so closely with a later, more developed artistic tradition? And was this the beginning of a visual language that would later define an entire region, or the echo of something already fading from memory even at the time it was made? This is where the mystery deepens, because marble is not a forgiving material. It is harder than limestone, more brittle than clay, and requires controlled pressure to shape without fracturing. And even in later periods, marble carving demanded specialized tools and techniques, often involving metal chisels and refined abrasives. But in 4500 BCE, the inhabitants of Siagos did not have metal tools, and their technological toolkit consisted primarily of harder stones, abrasive sand, and time, meaning that to produce the Siagos figurine, several steps would have been required, including initial shaping using percussive tools to remove bulk material, a process that carries high risk of cracking, followed by refinement through abrasion, likely using quartz sand or emery to gradually smooth and define contours, and finally surface smoothing, possibly through prolonged polishing, which could take hours or even days for a single object. And experimental archaeology suggests that shaping marble with stone tools is possible, but inefficient and unpredictable, requiring patience, consistency, and a deep understanding of material behavior. And achieving consistent curvature and symmetry is exponentially more difficult without calibrated instruments. And yet the figurine shows smooth transitions between planes, balanced proportions across its vertical axis, and no visible evidence of repeated correction or structural failure, no chipped edges that were later repaired, no asymmetry that suggests error. This raises a critical question. Was this the result of a long, lost tradition of craftsmanship passed down through generations, or an isolated achievement that should not have been possible at all? And even more puzzling, no workshop, no discarded fragments, and no failed attempts have been found at the site, leaving no archaeological footprint of the process, only the result, as if the knowledge existed only long enough to create this object, and then disappeared. In most ancient cultures, artistic objects exist within systems, whether religious, social, or funerary, and they are repeated, varied, and contextualized, forming patterns that allow archaeologists to interpret meaning. But the Siagos figurine is different, because it was not clearly associated with a burial. It was not part of a known ritual structure. It does not appear in large numbers across the site, and it exists almost in isolation, detached from a clear functional role. And this absence of context creates interpretive instability. Some researchers suggest it represents a fertility figure, but unlike Paleolithic Venus figurines, it lacks exaggerated anatomical features that emphasize reproduction, while others propose it may depict the deceased, echoing later funerary traditions seen in the Aegean, yet without supporting evidence such as burial placement or associated grave goods. And a third theory proposes something more abstract, that the figurine is not meant to represent a specific person or deity, but rather the concept of human form itself reduced to its most essential geometry, an idea that suggests symbolic abstraction rather than direct representation. And if true, this would imply a level of cognitive and artistic development rarely attributed to Neolithic societies, pushing back the timeline of abstract thinking in visual culture. When compared to later Cycladic figurines, dated between 2800 and 2300 BCE, the similarities are undeniable, from the folded arms to the elongated proportions and the emphasis on symmetry. But so is the gap, because in most cultural evolutions we expect to see gradual transitions, increasing complexity, experimentation, variation, and a clear lineage of development. Yet here we see something else entirely, a discontinuity, as if a fully realized idea appears, disappears, and then re-emerges centuries later. This pattern has led some archaeologists to propose that Siagos represents an early, isolated innovation, a cultural spark that did not immediately spread due to geographic or social limitations, while others argue that the gap is artificial, created by incomplete archaeological data, suggesting that intermediate forms may have existed but have not yet been discovered, buried beneath layers we have not yet reached or lost to erosion and time. But there is a third possibility, more unsettling, that the knowledge required to create such objects existed, developed, and was then lost, leaving behind only fragments that appear out of place in the timeline we have constructed. Do you think the Siagos figurine was the beginning of a new artistic idea, or the last surviving trace of a lost civilization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Entire island in the Aegean Sea was reshaped into a geometric pyramid thousands of years before classical Greece ever existed. Rising from the waters near the sacred island of Keros, Dascalio appears, at first glance, to be a natural rocky outcrop. But beneath its slopes lies evidence of something far more unsettling. Not a structure built on an island, but an island that was transformed into a structure. During the early Bronze Age, between approximately 2800 and 2300 BCE, human hands carved, transported, and assembled thousands of tons of stone to impose a deliberate, terraced geometry onto this small landmass. The result is a form so precise that from above it resembles a stepped pyramid, an architectural concept that should not exist in this place, at this time, with the tools available. What kind of society reshapes an island? And more importantly, why? The story of Dascalio begins not with the island itself, but with a mystery uncovered nearby. In the 20th century, archaeologists working on Keros began finding thousands of fragmented Cycladic marble figurines. These were not ordinary remains. The statues had been deliberately broken, their pieces transported from multiple islands across the Aegean, then deposited in a specific area on Keros. Radiocarbon dating and stylistic analysis placed them firmly within the early Bronze Age, suggesting a coordinated ritual practice spanning generations. This phenomenon became known as the Keros Hoard, one of the earliest large-scale ritual depositions ever discovered in Europe. But one question remained unresolved. Where did the people who performed these rituals live? Attention gradually shifted to Dascalio. Early surveys suggested minimal activity, almost dismissing it as an insignificant rocky extension of the surrounding landscape. But systematic excavations led by institutions such as the University of Cambridge and the British School at Athens would reveal something far more complex. Beneath layers of rubble and erosion, archaeologists uncovered terraces, walls, stairways, and structures arranged in a highly organized pattern. What had once been dismissed as a barren rock was, in fact, a densely built environment, one that had been deliberately engineered. As excavation progressed, each campaign brought new and increasingly unexpected discoveries. The earliest phases revealed that Dascalio had not always been an island. Geological analysis indicates that during the early Bronze Age, lower sea levels connected it to Keros by a narrow land bridge. This meant the site was originally part of a larger ritual landscape rather than an isolated outpost. Subsequent excavations uncovered extensive terracing systems. These were not random accumulations of stone. The retaining walls were carefully constructed using imported marble blocks, many sourced from the island of Naxos, located approximately 10 kilometers away. The scale of this effort is striking. Estimates suggest that thousands of tons of marble were transported across open water and then hauled up the steep slopes of Dascalio. The terraces were arranged in successive levels, creating a stepped profile that reshaped the natural topography into a controlled architectural form. Further discoveries revealed buildings, narrow pathways, drainage systems, and evidence of metallurgical activity. Crucibles, molds, and slag deposits indicate that copper processing took place on site, suggesting that Dascalio was not merely symbolic, it was functionally active. By the time excavations reached deeper layers, a picture began to emerge. Dascalio was a densely occupied, highly organized settlement integrated with the ritual activities on Keros. Among all the mysteries surrounding Dascalio, one stands above the rest in terms of sheer improbability: the transportation of its building materials. The marble used in construction does not originate from the island itself. Geological sourcing confirms that much of it came from Naxos, requiring extraction, shaping, and transport across approximately 10 kilometers of open sea. In the absence of advanced ships, cranes, or mechanical lifting systems, this process becomes difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Experimental archaeology suggests that Bronze Age communities may have used wooden sledges, rollers, and simple rafts. However, scaling these methods to account for thousands of tons of material introduces significant logistical challenges that are still not fully resolved. Even under ideal conditions, transporting a single block weighing several hundred kilograms would require coordinated labor, stable watercraft, and precise timing. Repeating this process hundreds or thousands of times implies a level of organization that approaches that of later, more complex civilizations. The comparison with Stonehenge is unavoidable. At Stonehenge, stones weighing up to 25 tons were moved over distances exceeding 200 kilometers. Yet despite decades of research, the exact methods remain debated. Dascalio presents a similar paradox on a smaller scale, but within a maritime environment. Instead of overland transport, materials had to cross open water, introducing variables such as currents, weather conditions, and buoyancy constraints that significantly complicate any reconstruction model. Another comparison can be drawn with the Great Pyramid of Giza, where millions of limestone blocks were quarried and assembled with remarkable precision. In Egypt, the presence of a centralized state and a large organized labor force offers a partial explanation for such an undertaking. At Dascalio, however, no clear evidence of a centralized authority has been identified. Yet the outcome, a transformed landscape requiring sustained effort over time, suggests coordination at a regional scale, possibly involving multiple island communities working toward a shared objective. What makes this problem particularly unresolved is not the possibility that transport occurred, but the absence of direct evidence detailing how it was achieved. No preserved boats, no clear harbour installations, and no definitive transport tools have been found. The result is a gap between capability and evidence, a hallmark of many ancient engineering mysteries. The purpose of Dascalio remains one of the most debated aspects of the site. One interpretation views it as a ritual center directly connected to the activities on Keros. The deliberate fragmentation of figurines and their deposition suggests a shared symbolic system across multiple communities, indicating that Dascalio may have functioned as a ceremonial hub where people gathered to participate in structured rituals. Another interpretation emphasizes its industrial features. The presence of metallurgical remains indicates that copper processing occurred on site, raising the possibility that Dascalio served as an early production center linked to emerging trade networks in the Aegean. A third perspective considers Dascalio as a proto-urban environment. The density of structures, the organization of space, and the integration of infrastructure point toward a form of settlement that predates classical urbanism. Each interpretation, however, introduces contradictions. A purely ritual site would not require such extensive infrastructure. A purely industrial site would not explain the symbolic significance of the figurine deposits. And a proto-city located on a steep, resource-limited island challenges conventional models of early urban development. These contradictions are precisely what make Dascalio so compelling as an archaeological puzzle. It resists simple classification, existing instead at the intersection of multiple functions and meanings. If a society with limited tools could reshape an entire island into a geometric structure, what other achievements might have existed and simply vanished without leaving a clear trace? Three stones rise from an open field in northern England, not arranged in a circle, not carved with symbols, and not surrounded by ruins. Just three towering monoliths standing in a line so precise it feels intentional. Each one weighs over 20 tons and stands taller than a modern two-story house. They have remained here for more than 5,000 years, and despite everything we understand about ancient engineering, no one can say with certainty why they were built. The site, now known as the Devil's Arrows, entered written history relatively late, only beginning to attract attention in the 18th century, when antiquarians started documenting unusual stone monuments across Britain, including those in North Yorkshire. Early sketches and written accounts suggest that more stones once stood here, possibly 4 or even 5, but by the time systematic observation and measurement began, only 3 remained upright. Unlike Stonehenge, which quickly became a focal point for scholarly investigation, the Devil's Arrows remained largely overlooked, perhaps because of its apparent simplicity. There were no circular layouts, no horizontal lintels, no immediately obvious astronomical markers, only scale and silence. However, measurements taken during the 19th and 20th centuries gradually shifted this perception. The tallest stone reaches approximately 7.6 meters in height, making it one of the tallest prehistoric standing stones in Britain, while the others, though slightly shorter, still exceed 6 meters. Each stone is estimated to weigh between 20 and 30 tons, confirming that these are not accidental features of the landscape, but deliberate constructions created through coordinated human effort. The monoliths are composed of millstone grit sandstone, a material that is relatively common in parts of northern England, which at first seems to simplify the mystery by suggesting a local origin. However, this assumption quickly becomes more complex upon closer examination. The nearest known source of stone large enough to produce these monoliths lies approximately 2 to 3 kilometers away. While this distance may seem insignificant by modern standards, it represents a considerable logistical challenge for Neolithic communities that lacked metal tools, wheeled transport, and domesticated animals capable of hauling massive loads. Each stone would have required coordinated labor, potentially involving dozens or even hundreds of individuals to quarry, minimally shape, transport, and erect. What is particularly striking is the relative uniformity of the stones. Although not identical, they share a consistent vertical emphasis and proportion, suggesting they were not simply selected at random but deliberately chosen or modified to meet a specific visual or structural intent. The most unsettling question remains how these stones were moved at all. Weighing between 20 and 30 tons each, the Devil's Arrows fall within the lower range of megalithic stones used at Stonehenge, yet the context here is far less understood. While Stonehenge provides evidence of quarry sites, construction phases, and possible transport routes, the Devil's Arrows offers no such clarity. The surrounding terrain complicates any simple explanation. The nearby River Nid, combined with what was likely a prehistoric landscape of wetlands, uneven ground, and seasonal flooding, would have made transporting such massive stones extraordinarily difficult without advanced tools. Several hypotheses have been proposed, including the use of wooden log rollers to reduce friction, sledges dragged across lubricated surfaces such as wet clay or animal fat, or even seasonal movement across frozen ground during winter. While experimental archaeology has demonstrated that small groups can move large stones using simple techniques, scaling these methods up to stones of this size introduces significant challenges in coordination, force distribution, and stability. More critically, there is no direct archaeological evidence to confirm any of these methods were used here, no preserved trackways, no identifiable tool marks, and no supporting infrastructure. This absence of evidence does not imply the use of unknown or advanced technology, but it does highlight the limits of our current understanding. We are left reconstructing possibilities rather than confirming facts, and that gap between theory and proof remains one of the most persistent mysteries surrounding the site. Compared to larger prehistoric monuments, the Devil's Arrows has yielded surprisingly little material evidence. Excavations and surveys conducted in the surrounding area have revealed minimal signs of permanent settlement, with only scattered flint tools typical of Neolithic activity and no significant concentration of artifacts. There is also an absence of burial structures or clearly defined ritual deposits directly associated with the stones, which is unusual given that many prehistoric monuments are integrated into broader landscapes of human activity, including habitation sites, ceremonial spaces, or burial complexes. Here, the stones appear largely isolated. Geophysical surveys have attempted to detect subsurface features such as ditches, post holes, or buried stones, but results have remained inconclusive. Some evidence suggests that additional stones may once have existed and were later removed or destroyed, though the exact number and original arrangement remain uncertain. Historical records from the 18th century mention a fourth stone that has since disappeared, possibly broken apart for building material, raising the possibility that the original alignment extended further than what is visible today. The three remaining stones form a nearly perfect linear alignment, a fact supported not just by visual observation, but by measured survey data, indicating a consistent axis and deliberate spacing. This alignment does not appear random, yet its purpose remains unclear. Unlike Stonehenge, which demonstrates well-documented alignments with solar events such as the summer solstice sunrise and winter solstice sunset, the Devil's Arrows has not shown any definitive correlation with known astronomical phenomena. Attempts to connect the alignment to solar or lunar cycles have produced inconsistent or inconclusive results, creating a paradox. The precision is too great to dismiss as coincidence, yet not specific enough to confirm a clear function. This ambiguity has led to several competing interpretations, including the possibility that the stones marked a ceremonial route used in ritual processions, defined territorial boundaries within the landscape, or represented a symbolic alignment tied to beliefs that are no longer understood. Without written records or supporting archaeological evidence, each of these interpretations remains speculative. When compared to Stonehenge, the contrast becomes particularly striking. Stonehenge is structurally complex, featuring concentric circles, horizontal lintels, and multiple phases of construction that provide valuable insight into its use and development. Extensive research has revealed evidence of burial practices, ritual activity, and precise astronomical alignment. In contrast, the Devil's Arrows presents a far simpler form, just a linear arrangement of stones, yet offers far fewer clues. Its archaeological footprint is minimal, its historical documentation limited, and its function almost entirely unknown. This simplicity, rather than making it easier to understand, actually deepens the mystery. Without additional context, the structure resists interpretation, leaving only the undeniable evidence of intentional design and significant human effort, but no clear explanation of purpose. If moving these stones required such immense effort and coordination, what purpose could have been important enough to justify it? It looks like nothing more than a carved slab of stone rows of narrow slots, a simple vertical channel, no moving parts, no visible mechanism. And yet this object, known as the Kleroterion, was designed to solve one of the most difficult problems any society has ever faced: how to create fairness that cannot be manipulated. In an era without probability theory, without computation, without even a formal language for randomness, the citizens of Athens constructed a system that behaves like a physical algorithm, producing outcomes that, once set in motion, escape human control. The problem they were trying to solve was not abstract. In a direct democracy, legitimacy depends entirely on trust. Jurors, officials, and civic participants had to be selected in a way that could not be influenced by wealth, reputation, or hidden alliances. Any suspicion of bias would not just undermine a decision, it would destabilize the entire system. Selection by hand was too vulnerable. Selection by authority was too corruptible. What they needed was something fundamentally different, a process that removed intention itself. The Kleroterion was not just a tool, it was a deliberate attempt to eliminate human interference at the point where power is assigned. Its construction reflects that goal with almost unsettling clarity. A vertical stone slab is carved with precise columns of rectangular slots, each designed to hold a panachion, a small bronze identity plate representing a citizen. These plates are arranged into rows, forming a structured grid of participants. Alongside the slab runs a narrow tube. Into this tube, a sequence of black and white balls is introduced. There are no hidden mechanisms, no concealed chambers, no complex engineering. Everything is visible. Everything is exposed. The system does not rely on secrecy to function, it relies on total transparency, making manipulation not just difficult, but immediately detectable. The operation unfolds step by step. Citizens' tokens are inserted into the grid. Once arranged, the process begins. Balls are released into the vertical tube, descending one by one under gravity. Each ball determines the fate of an entire row. A white ball selects that row, a black ball rejects it. There is no appeal, no override, no human adjustment once the process starts. The outcome emerges from a sequence of physical events, governed by simple rules, but impossible to reverse without being seen. The machine does not decide in the human sense, but it produces decisions nonetheless. At first glance, this might seem like a crude approximation of randomness, but that interpretation fails under closer scrutiny. True randomness is one of the most difficult phenomena to generate reliably. Even today, modern systems rely on highly controlled physical processes, quantum fluctuations, thermal noise, or complex algorithms designed to simulate unpredictability. The Kleroterion achieves something surprisingly similar, using nothing but gravity, motion, and binary outcomes. It does not produce perfect randomness, but it produces enough unpredictability to disrupt any consistent pattern of control. It transforms uncertainty into a structured, repeatable process. And this is where the deeper mystery begins. The Athenians had no formal framework for understanding probability. The mathematics required to describe randomness would not exist for nearly 2,000 years. There were no equations, no statistical models, no theoretical guarantees. And yet, through practical necessity, they engineered a system that behaves like a random selection device. Not conceptually, but physically. This suggests not formal knowledge, but an intuitive understanding, an empirical realization that fairness can emerge when human intention is removed and replaced with controlled unpredictability. The implications are profound. The Kleroterion is not simply a political instrument, it is a philosophical construct. It encodes the idea that fairness is not achieved by choosing the most qualified or the most powerful, but by refusing to choose at all. It replaces judgment with process. It removes preference from the equation entirely. In doing so, it challenges one of the most deeply rooted assumptions in governance, that decisions must be made by people. Instead, it proposes that under certain conditions, a system governed by rules can produce outcomes that are more just than any individual could achieve. But the system is not beyond suspicion. The appearance of randomness is not the same as its reality. The sequence of balls, the method by which they are loaded, the physical structure of the grid, each introduces variables that could, in theory, create subtle biases. If the balls are not perfectly mixed, patterns might emerge. If certain positions within the grid are more likely to be selected due to unnoticed asymmetries, the system could drift away from fairness over time. These are not trivial concerns. Even modern random number generators require constant validation, precisely because small imperfections can lead to significant consequences. This creates a tension at the core of the Kleroterion. It is designed to eliminate manipulation, and it largely succeeds by making interference visible and impractical. But it cannot eliminate uncertainty about the quality of its randomness. It achieves fairness not by perfection, but by approximation, by making any attempt at control so difficult and so exposed that it becomes functionally irrelevant. In this sense, it is not a perfect system. It is a resilient one. The philosophical dimension deepens when considering how this system was perceived by those who used it. The citizens of Athens were not merely interacting with a machine, they were placing trust in the idea that randomness itself could serve as a form of justice. This is a counterintuitive concept. Random outcomes can appear unfair in the short term. They can produce imbalances, coincidences, and seemingly arbitrary results. And yet, over repeated use, they tend toward equilibrium. The Kleroterion embodies this paradox, that fairness over time may require accepting unpredictability in the moment. When viewed through a modern lens, the parallels are striking. Today, randomness underpins entire technological systems. It is used in cryptography to secure information, in algorithms to simulate complex processes, in artificial intelligence to introduce variability and exploration. These systems rely on the same principle, that unpredictability, when properly structured, can prevent control and bias. The Kleroterion represents an early physical realization of this idea, a non-digital, non-mathematical precursor to algorithmic thinking. What makes this even more remarkable is how easily it can be overlooked. It lacks the visual impact of monumental architecture. It does not display the obvious complexity of advanced engineering. Its significance is not in its appearance, but in its function, in the abstract logic it encodes within a simple physical form. It is a reminder that technological sophistication is not always visible. Sometimes, the most advanced ideas are hidden within the most unassuming objects. And then there is the question that remains unresolved. Why did this concept not evolve further? The idea of institutionalized randomness, of using controlled unpredictability as a foundation for fairness, appears far ahead of its time. And yet, it did not lead to a continuous development of more advanced systems in the ancient world. It did not produce a lineage of increasingly sophisticated devices. Instead, it remains largely isolated, a singular innovation that did not fully propagate. This absence raises further questions. Was the system fully understood by its users or simply accepted as effective? Did its designers grasp the deeper implications of what they had created? Or was it the result of iterative refinement without theoretical insight? And perhaps most importantly, what other ideas of similar depth might have existed, only to be lost without record? Would you trust a system based on randomness to decide something important in your life? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Massive stone rests along the banks of the Taunton River, its surface covered in lines, figures, and symbols that refuse to resolve into a single stable meaning. For more than 3 centuries, Dighton Rock has remained one of the most debated artifacts in North America, not because it is hidden or inaccessible, but because it is fully visible and still resists understanding. The issue is not a lack of information. The issue is that the information contradicts itself, producing interpretations that cannot be reconciled into a single coherent explanation. The rock weighs over 40 tons and was once partially submerged along the river's edge, which meant that for much of its documented history, only sections of its surface were visible at any given time. This limited perspective shaped early observations. When John Danforth first recorded the stone in the late 17th century, he described markings that resembled writing but could not be linked to any known system. That initial uncertainty did not diminish with time, it expanded. Later observers produced drawings that differed in subtle but important ways, suggesting that interpretation was influenced not only by what was carved into the stone, but also by the expectations and assumptions brought by each observer. The rock did not change, the readings of it did. At first glance, the carved surface appears chaotic. There are human-like figures, geometric patterns, intersecting lines, and abstract shapes that suggest structure without ever fully establishing it. Some elements resemble tally marks or symbolic notation, while others look like stylized representations of people or animals. The central problem is consistency. A true writing system tends to repeat recognizable forms, establish syntax, and reveal patterns that can be traced across its surface. Dighton Rock does not convincingly display these features. Instead, it offers fragments suggestive but incomplete, forcing any attempt at interpretation to rely on selective recognition rather than systematic decoding. This ambiguity created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, competing explanations emerged, each attempting to impose order on a surface that resists it. The most grounded explanation attributes the carvings to indigenous peoples of the region, particularly the Wampanoag. This aligns with the broader presence of petroglyph traditions across North America. However, even within this interpretation, there are unresolved inconsistencies. The density of the markings, the extent of overlap, and the apparent lack of clear compositional hierarchy differ from many documented indigenous carvings in the surrounding area. While it is entirely possible that the rock represents a localized variation or a unique ceremonial expression, it does not fit comfortably within established patterns. It explains part of the evidence, but not all of it. More controversial interpretations attempt to link the carvings to transoceanic contact before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Some researchers have suggested that certain shapes resemble Norse runes, implying a possible connection to Viking exploration in North America. Others have argued for similarities with Phoenician or Iberian scripts, raising the possibility that ancient Mediterranean sailors may have crossed the Atlantic long before conventional history allows. These claims are compelling at a glance, particularly when individual symbols appear to resemble known alphabets. But the broader structure does not support them. The supposed characters do not organize into readable sequences, and no supporting archaeological evidence has been discovered nearby to confirm sustained contact. What appears meaningful in isolation becomes unstable when considered as part of the whole. A more restrained interpretation suggests that the rock is not the product of a single culture or time period. Instead, it may represent a cumulative surface, one that was marked repeatedly over generations. Different groups, at different times, could have added their own carvings, resulting in the layered complexity visible today. Modern imaging techniques support this possibility, revealing variations in carving depth, style, and weathering. Some lines are faint and heavily eroded, while others are sharper, suggesting more recent additions. Under this model, the rock is not a single message but an accumulation of many. Yet this explanation introduces a new problem. If the carvings span long periods of time, why was this particular stone repeatedly chosen? Why did different groups return to the same surface, rather than create new ones elsewhere? This leads directly to the central question, the one that defines the entire mystery. Who created Dighton Rock? If the carvings were made entirely by the Wampanoag or related indigenous groups, then they represent a form of expression that has not yet been fully understood. This would imply that current frameworks for interpreting North American petroglyphs are incomplete, and that meaning may still exist beyond our present ability to decode it. In this scenario, the limitation lies not in the artifact, but in the interpretive models applied to it. If the carvings are evidence of early transatlantic contact, the implications are far more disruptive. It would suggest that ancient navigation extended beyond what is currently documented, and that traces of those journeys survive in ambiguous forms that are difficult to confirm. But for this interpretation to hold, the carvings would need to align more clearly with known writing systems, and they do not. Similarity at the level of individual symbols is not sufficient. Without structure, there is no language. If the rock is a layered artifact, built up gradually over time by different groups, then the mystery shifts from authorship to continuity. What made this location significant enough to attract repeated attention? Was it a landmark, a ritual site, or simply an accessible surface along an important waterway? And if multiple cultures interacted with it, were they responding to earlier carvings or adding to something they did not understand? In this interpretation, the rock becomes less a message and more a point of convergence, a place where meaning accumulated without ever forming a unified system. Each explanation resolves one aspect of the puzzle while creating another. That is the defining characteristic of Dighton Rock. It resists closure not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence points in multiple directions at the same time. Modern analysis has clarified the problem, but it has not solved it. High-resolution scanning and controlled lighting have revealed additional details, but increased clarity only sharpens the contradictions. The carvings do not converge into a coherent system or narrative. They remain fragmented, as if the original context, the framework required to interpret them, has been lost entirely. In that sense, Dighton Rock is more than an archaeological artifact. It is a demonstration of how meaning can disappear even when the physical record remains intact. The symbols are still there, carved into stone, unchanged in form. What is missing is the system that once made them intelligible. What do you think Dighton Rock really is and who created it? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. At first glance, this skeleton should not be controversial. A child, buried in sediment for over 1.6 million years, discovered in a remote region near Lake Turkana in Kenya. And yet, once reconstructed, measured, and compared against everything we think we know about human evolution, it becomes clear that this is not just another fossil. It is a contradiction, one that forces a re-evaluation of how and when the human body became modern. The discovery took place in 1984, when Kenyan fossil hunter Kamoya Kimo uncovered a remarkably complete skeleton belonging to a young individual of Homo erectus. Catalogued as KNM-WT 15000, the specimen would later be known as Turkana Boy. What makes it extraordinary is not simply its age, but its preservation. Roughly 90% of the skeleton was recovered, an almost unheard-of level of completeness in paleoanthropology, where most finds consist of isolated fragments. For comparison, the famous Lucy, discovered in 1974, is only about 40% complete. This alone makes Turkana Boy one of the most important reference specimens ever found. But completeness is only the beginning of the problem. When scientists reconstructed the skeleton, they found a body plan that looks strikingly familiar. Long legs, relatively short arms, a narrow pelvis, and a body adapted for efficient bipedal locomotion. These proportions closely resemble those of modern humans rather than earlier hominins such as Australopithecus, which retained longer arms and shorter legs suited for climbing. Based on growth models, Turkana Boy is estimated to have stood about 1.6 meters tall at death, with a projected adult height approaching 1.8 meters. That places him well within the range of modern human populations, despite living over 1 million years earlier. This raises an immediate question. Why does a body that looks so modern appear so early in the evolutionary timeline? According to conventional models, human evolution proceeds gradually, with anatomical features changing incrementally over time. Yet Turkana Boy seems to leap ahead in terms of body structure. His limb proportions suggest an adaptation for endurance running, something associated with persistence hunting, a strategy that requires advanced thermoregulation and long-distance mobility. These are not primitive traits. They imply a level of physiological optimization that appears, at first glance, out of sequence. The contradiction deepens when we examine the brain. Turkana Boy's cranial capacity is estimated at approximately 880 cubic centimeters. This is significantly larger than that of earlier hominins, but still far below the modern human average of around 1,350 cubic centimeters. In other words, the body looks modern, but the brain does not. This creates a mismatch that challenges a widely held assumption. that increases in brain size drive other aspects of human evolution. If that were true, we would expect the brain to lead, not lag behind. Instead, Turkana Boy suggests a different possibility. The human body may have reached a near-modern form before the brain caught up. If so, then the sequence of evolutionary development is not as linear as once believed. Rather than a smooth progression, it may involve overlapping phases, where different systems evolve at different rates. Even more puzzling is the question of growth and development. Determining the age of Turkana Boy at death has proven surprisingly complex. Dental analysis suggests an age of around 8 years, based on comparisons with modern human children. However, some researchers argue that Homo erectus may have matured more rapidly, more like modern chimpanzees. If that is the case, Turkana Boy could have been closer to adolescence, or even near maturity at the time of death. This discrepancy is not trivial. It affects estimates of growth rate, lifespan, and social structure. If Homo erectus developed quickly, it would imply shorter childhoods and potentially less time for learning complex behaviors. On the other hand, a slower, more human-like growth pattern would suggest extended development and the possibility of more sophisticated social systems. At present, the evidence does not decisively support either model. The result is a gap in our understanding of how early humans lived and learned. The skeleton also preserves clues about health and mortality, but these two are inconclusive. There are subtle abnormalities in the spine, including signs consistent with a possible infection or developmental disorder. Some researchers have proposed that Turkana Boy suffered from a condition such as scoliosis or a systemic illness that may have contributed to his death. However, no definitive cause has been established. There are no clear signs of trauma, predation, or catastrophic injury. The exact circumstances of his death remain unknown. Another layer of uncertainty involves respiration and vocalization. The structure of the rib cage and vertebral canal suggests differences in breathing control compared to modern humans. Some studies indicate that Homo erectus may have had less precise neural control over the diaphragm, potentially limiting the ability to produce complex, sustained vocalizations. This has implications for the evolution of language. If Turkana Boy's species lacked fine respiratory control, then fully developed speech may not yet have been possible. Yet other aspects of their anatomy and behavior hint at increasing cognitive sophistication. Once again, the evidence points in different directions. Perhaps the most overlooked issue is statistical. Turkana Boy is, in many ways, a sample size of 1. Despite being the most complete Homo erectus skeleton ever found, it represents a single individual. In any scientific context, drawing broad conclusions from a single specimen is risky. There is always the possibility that Turkana Boy was atypical, either unusually tall, unusually well preserved, or even affected by conditions that altered his development. And yet, due to the lack of comparable finds, this one skeleton carries enormous weight in shaping our understanding of an entire species. This creates a paradox. The more complete and detailed the specimen, the more influence it has. But the more influence it has, the more dangerous it becomes if it is not representative. When placed within the broader fossil record, Turkana Boy highlights a series of gaps. Between Homo erectus and later species such as Homo sapiens, there are discontinuities in technology, behavior, and cognition. Stone tools become more sophisticated, social structures more complex, symbolic behavior more apparent, but the transitions are not always gradual or clearly documented. Instead, they appear in bursts, separated by periods of relative stability. This pattern has led some researchers to question whether human evolution is best understood as a continuous process at all. Rather than a straight line, it may be a mosaic, composed of traits that emerge, stabilize, and sometimes disappear before reappearing in new forms. Turkana Boy fits into this mosaic, but not neatly. He represents a combination of features that do not fully align with any single stage. If Turkana Boy represents a stage of evolution that doesn't fully match our models, then what kind of missing evidence or missing species do you think could fill that gap? Perfectly smooth metal spheres are among the simplest objects in physics. Their motion can be predicted, modeled, and reduced to basic equations of inertia, friction, and gravity, where energy dissipates predictably through contact with a surface. And yet, in 1974, a single sphere was found that appeared to ignore those rules not dramatically, not violently, but subtly enough to create a contradiction that still has no complete resolution. The problem is not what the object is. The problem is what it does. Because every observed behavior suggests internal complexity, while every external measurement suggests simplicity. And when those two things exist at the same time, the result is not just curiosity, it is a breakdown in explanation. In March 1974, the Betts family discovered the sphere on their property near Fort George Island, Florida, shortly after a brush fire had cleared part of the land. The object was immediately unusual. A near-perfect metallic sphere, approximately 20 centimeters in diameter and weighing close to 9.5 kilograms, a density comparable to high-grade steel alloys. The surface was polished to an almost mirror-like finish, interrupted only by a small triangular indentation. No seams, weld lines, or manufacturing marks were visible, an absence that matters, because even precision industrial spheres typically leave microscopic traces of machining or casting. At first, the object was treated as a curiosity, possibly debris from military testing or aerospace activity, especially given Florida's proximity to testing ranges. But within days, the family began noticing behaviors that did not match any passive object governed solely by inertia and friction. When placed on the floor and pushed, the sphere did not simply roll, slow, and stop as expected under classical mechanics. Instead, it would change direction without external input, slow down and then reverse course, and in some cases return toward its starting point. From a physics standpoint, this introduces a contradiction. A solid, homogeneous sphere should lose kinetic energy due to friction and eventually come to rest, following predictable decay curves. The Betts sphere, however, appeared to retain or redistribute motion in a way that suggested internal dynamics or shifting mass. One of the most cited observations involved placing the sphere on a table. Rather than rolling off the edge under gravity, it would alter its path, stopping or curving away before reaching the boundary. While slight surface imperfections, micro-tilts, or uneven mass distribution could explain minor deviations, repeated avoidance patterns imply a level of feedback behavior that passive objects do not possess. In controlled comparisons, even spheres with deliberately offset centers of mass produce predictable arcs, not adaptive or repeated path correction. The anomaly deepened when the sphere appeared to respond to sound. When a guitar was played nearby, the object reportedly began to vibrate and move in a more active and sustained pattern. From a scientific perspective, acoustic resonance is real and measurable. Objects can absorb sound energy and convert it into vibration if their natural frequency aligns with the input. However, for a dense metal sphere of roughly 9.5 kilograms, the energy required to produce visible motion from airborne sound waves is non-trivial. Typical sound pressure levels from a guitar produce energy densities far below what is needed to overcome static friction for a heavy object. Even in controlled laboratory environments, inducing macroscopic motion via acoustic resonance requires precise tuning, amplification, and often specialized structures. This raises a critical question. Was the sphere amplifying external energy through an internal resonance system, or was there an undiscovered mechanism converting minimal acoustic input into measurable kinetic output? The sphere was later examined using X-ray imaging, revealing that it was not a uniform solid object. Instead, it appeared to contain a denser outer shell and a possible internal core or secondary structure, suggesting a layered or composite design. This configuration is significant. If the internal mass is offset or capable of independent movement, it could dynamically shift the center of gravity, producing non-linear rolling behavior. Such systems are known in engineering, but they require precise calibration and typically rely on external energy inputs. This leads to a constraint. For an internal mechanism to move repeatedly without external power, it must either store energy extremely efficiently or operate on principles not fully understood in this context. No confirmed method of opening the sphere without destroying it was reported, leaving its internal design inaccessible and its function speculative. One of the most widely proposed explanations is that the object was an industrial ball check valve, a component used in pipelines to regulate fluid flow. These devices contain a spherical element that can move within a chamber, allowing or blocking passage depending on pressure. This comparison provides a partial match, including spherical geometry and the presence of an internal movable component. However, several inconsistencies remain. Industrial valves of similar size typically weigh less or exhibit visible structural features such as seams or access points. They are not designed to exhibit autonomous motion outside a pressurized system, nor do they respond to acoustic input in a controlled or repeatable manner. Another comparison involves weighted spheres used in engineering demonstrations, where off-center mass creates unusual rolling paths. Yet these systems require carefully engineered asymmetry and produce predictable, not adaptive motion. The Betz sphere occupies a narrow gap. It resembles known objects in structure, but exceeds them in behavior, creating a mismatch between classification and observation. The object eventually attracted the attention of the United States Navy, which conducted its own analysis. While the full details of these examinations were not widely released, available reports indicate that the sphere underwent material testing and observational study. The conclusions did not provide a definitive explanation. No advanced propulsion systems, electronics, or classified technologies were identified. The material composition was described as consistent with high-grade steel, a known and widely used industrial material. This creates a paradox. If the material is ordinary and the structure appears relatively simple, then the behavior should be explainable within established physical models. Yet the observations suggest otherwise, reinforcing the gap between measurable properties and observed dynamics. At the center of the Betz sphere case is a pattern familiar across many unresolved anomalies. The physical object appears simple, the observed behavior appears complex, and existing models explain parts but not the whole. This gap is not large enough to confirm extraordinary claims, but it is persistent enough to resist closure. In physics, unexplained behavior typically leads to one of two outcomes. Either the observation is flawed, or the model is incomplete. The Betz sphere exists precisely at that intersection, where repeated observations challenge the sufficiency of current explanations without clearly violating known laws. If a simple metal sphere can produce behavior that challenges assumptions about motion, energy, and internal structure, then how many other ordinary objects might reveal the same contradictions if examined closely enough? Buried beneath the soils of central Ukraine lies evidence of a building so large, so organized, and so deliberately constructed that it challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions in archaeology, that complex, large-scale architecture requires complex, hierarchical societies. At a time when most human communities were expected to live in small, scattered villages, Nebolivka reveals something entirely different. A coordinated, planned settlement stretching across more than 250 hectares, with a central structure that many researchers now describe as a temple. But the deeper archaeologists dig, the more unsettling the pattern becomes. This was not just built, it was burned. And the question is not how it was destroyed, but why it was designed to be destroyed at all. The story begins not with excavation, but with anomalies detected from above. In the early 21st century, aerial surveys and geophysical scans revealed faint circular patterns beneath agricultural fields near the village of Nebolivka. What initially appeared to be irregular soil marks soon resolved into something far more structured: concentric rings of dwellings, radial pathways, and a dense, organized layout extending over roughly 260 hectares. This site belonged to the Tripilia culture, a Neolithic society dated to approximately 4000 to 3500 BCE. Based on settlement density, researchers estimated a population between 10,000 and 15,000 individuals. For comparison, this places Nebolivka on a scale comparable to early Uruk, widely considered one of the world's first true cities. Yet Uruk flourished nearly a millennium later. The implication was immediate and controversial. Either Nebolivka represented an early form of urbanism far ahead of its time, or our definition of what constitutes a city was fundamentally incomplete. Initial excavations focused on anomalies detected near the center of the settlement. What archaeologists uncovered was not a typical dwelling, but a massive rectangular building measuring approximately 60 meters in length and 20 meters in width, covering more than 1,000 square meters. Evidence suggested that the structure may have been 2 stories high, an extraordinary architectural feat for a Neolithic society relying on wood and clay. Inside, researchers identified multiple rooms with distinct functions: raised platforms interpreted as altars, fragments of clay figurines, storage features, and carefully organized interior divisions. The absence of domestic debris such as cooking waste or everyday tools indicated that this was not a residential building. At this stage, comparisons became unavoidable. Sites such as Çatalhöyük, dating to a similar period, display dense habitation but lack centralized monumental structures of this scale. Nebolivka, by contrast, appeared to possess a focal building that required coordinated labor, planning, and symbolic intent. The term temple began to circulate not as a definitive classification, but as a working hypothesis. Subsequent field seasons expanded the excavation area and integrated high-resolution magnetometry data. The settlement's layout became increasingly clear. Thousands of structures arranged in concentric rings, intersected by radial pathways, with open spaces that may have functioned as communal zones. This level of spatial organization suggests intentional planning rather than organic growth. In contrast, many early settlements evolved incrementally, producing irregular layouts shaped by terrain and social clustering. Nebolivka, however, exhibits geometric consistency across a vast area. The central megastructure occupies a strategic position within this layout, reinforcing its importance. Yet no evidence of fortifications, administrative buildings, or elite residences has been identified. This absence raises a critical contradiction. The site demonstrates large-scale coordination, but lacks the hierarchical markers typically associated with such organization. Was Nebolivka governed by an unseen authority, Or does it represent a fundamentally different model of social cooperation? One of the most striking discoveries emerged from the analysis of structural remains. The central building and many surrounding structures had been subjected to intense burning. The temperatures reached were sufficient to transform clay surfaces into hardened, ceramic-like material. Crucially, the burn patterns do not align with accidental fire. Instead, they suggest controlled, deliberate ignition. The distribution of heat, the uniformity of damage, and the lack of chaotic collapse all point toward a coordinated event. This phenomenon is not unique to Nebolivka. Other Tripilia sites exhibit similar evidence of burning. However, the scale observed here is unprecedented. Entire sections of the settlement appear to have been intentionally destroyed. Several hypotheses have been proposed. One suggests ritual renewal, in which structures were periodically burned and rebuilt as part of a cyclical belief system. Another interprets the burning as a form of social or symbolic closure, an intentional erasure marking the end of occupation. Yet no consensus has been reached. What remains is a pattern that defies conventional explanations, a society investing enormous effort into construction, only to systematically dismantle its own achievements. At first glance, the construction techniques at Nebolivka appear straightforward. Buildings were constructed using timber frameworks coated with layers of clay, a method consistent with Neolithic architecture across Europe. No metal tools, no advanced engineering systems, and no evidence of specialized materials have been identified. However, the outcome tells a different story. When subjected to high temperatures during the burning phase, the clay coatings underwent a transformation. They hardened into a durable, brick-like substance, significantly increasing structural stability and longevity. In some cases, these materials exhibit properties comparable to early fired bricks, which are typically associated with later civilizations in Mesopotamia. Experimental archaeology has attempted to replicate this process by constructing similar timber and clay structures and burning them under controlled conditions. Researchers have demonstrated that such transformations are possible, but only within specific temperature ranges and burn durations. Achieving consistent results would require either precise control or repeated experience. This raises a critical question. Was this effect intentional or accidental? If intentional, it implies that the builders of Nebolivka possessed an empirical understanding of material transformation, recognizing that controlled burning could enhance durability. If accidental, it suggests that a byproduct of ritual destruction inadvertently produced a superior construction material. In either case, the result is the same: a simple technology producing outcomes that appear disproportionately advanced. When compared to early Mesopotamian brick production, which involved deliberate kiln firing and standardized molds, Nebolivka represents a parallel pathway less formalized, yet functionally effective. This challenges the linear model of technological development, in which innovations are assumed to emerge in a single region and diffuse outward. Instead, Nebolivka suggests that complex material knowledge may have arisen independently in forms that are difficult to recognize within traditional frameworks. The evidence converges on a series of unresolved questions. First, the nature of the settlement itself. Is Nebolivka a true city, predating urbanism as defined by Mesopotamian models, or is it a large aggregation of seasonal populations, an intermittent gathering place rather than a permanent habitation? Second, the function of the central megastructure. While ritual activity is strongly indicated, the scale and complexity of the building exceed what is typically associated with purely ceremonial spaces in Neolithic contexts. Could it have served multiple roles, religious, social, and administrative, within a society that left no written records? Third, the meaning of the burning events. If these were ritual acts, what belief system required the destruction of such significant investments? If they were practical, what purpose did they serve in the life cycle of the settlement? Each question points to a deeper issue: the possibility that our current models of early human societies are too narrow to accommodate the variability observed in the archaeological record. Scholars remain divided. Some argue that Nebolivka represents a form of low-density urbanism, where large-scale coordination was achieved without centralized authority. Others suggest it was only a periodic gathering site, making its size appear more like a city than it actually was. The central structure is also debated. It may have been a temple, but it is equally possible that modern interpretations are being projected onto a prehistoric context. Without written records, all conclusions rely on material evidence, and that evidence allows for multiple interpretations. What is clear is that Nebolivka does not fit any existing model. It exists somewhere between a village and a city, between ritual and infrastructure, and between simplicity and a level of complexity that remains difficult to explain. If Nebolivka was not a city in the way we understand cities, then what exactly was it? And how many other cities in history have we completely misunderstood? In the arid plains of southern Kazakhstan, a massive stone complex rises from the earth with a precision that feels almost out of place. Its walls are thick, its geometry deliberate, its scale undeniable. And yet, despite the effort required to build it, despite the engineering knowledge embedded in every cut stone, it was never finished. No inscriptions explain it. No records confirm its purpose. It stands as a contradiction, evidence of planning without execution, ambition without completion. This is the mystery of Akiotas complex, a structure that appears to have been designed for something important, but abandoned before that purpose was ever realized. Unlike many ancient monuments tied to known civilizations, Akiotas emerged into modern awareness without a clear historical narrative. The site was first systematically recorded in the 19th century by Russian explorers surveying Central Asia, but even early observers were struck by the same problem that persists today. There was no definitive explanation for what they were looking at. No nearby settlements, no written accounts, no cultural continuity linking the structure to a known urban system. This absence is not trivial. In archaeology, context is everything, and Akiotas exists almost entirely without it. There are no burial grounds directly associated with it, no inscriptions carved into its stone surfaces, and no artifacts that clearly anchor it to a specific ethnic or political identity. It is, in many ways, a structure without a voice. Later archaeological studies dated the complex roughly to the 8th century, placing it within the period of the Umayyad Caliphate. This dating was based on ceramic fragments, stratigraphic analysis, and construction-style comparisons. However, even this attribution remains debated. Unlike major Umayyad sites such as Qasr Amra, which feature frescoes, inscriptions, and recognizable Islamic architectural elements, Akiotas lacks the decorative programs and cultural markers that typically confirm identity. From the very beginning, the site presented a paradox, a monumental structure without a clear cultural signature, existing at the edge of what history can confidently explain. Excavations across the 20th and 21st centuries revealed a structure far more complex than early observers assumed. The site spans approximately 2.5 hectares, enclosed by walls up to 5 meters thick. Its layout follows a near-perfect rectangle, measuring around 180 by 205 meters, indicating deliberate planning and precise measurement. Such geometric consistency suggests the use of standardized units and centralized control over construction. Inside this perimeter, Archaeologists uncovered the foundations of multiple rooms, corridors, and courtyards arranged around a central open space. The layout hints at an administrative or ceremonial function, yet something fundamental is missing. There are no hearths, no dense concentrations of pottery, no evidence of daily human life. In comparable settlements from the same period, layers of occupation leave behind clear traces of habitation. At Akiotas, those traces are absent, reinforcing the idea that the complex was never fully occupied. The materials used at Akiotas raise further questions. The structure is built from massive red sandstone blocks, many weighing several tons, quarried and transported with considerable effort. These stones were not simply stacked, they were shaped with notable precision. In certain sections, the joints between blocks are so tight that mortar is minimal or entirely absent. This technique invites comparison with other ancient stoneworking traditions, such as Inca masonry or Egyptian temple construction, where tight-fitting blocks increase durability and structural integrity. However, such comparisons only deepen the mystery. There is no evidence of technological exchange between Central Asia and these distant regions. The similarity lies in the outcome, not in any known connection, suggesting that different cultures may have independently developed advanced stoneworking techniques under specific conditions. One of the most revealing features of Akiotas is its partially developed infrastructure. Archaeologists identified channels, basins, and possible conduits that appear to form a basic water management system. In a semi-arid environment, such planning would have been essential for sustaining long-term occupation. Yet the system presents contradictions. It is too limited to support a large population, yet too complex to belong to a temporary outpost. This imbalance suggests that the builders were working toward a specific functional goal, one that required controlled water distribution, but never reached completion. The infrastructure remains in a transitional state, reinforcing the impression of an interrupted project. The geometry of Akiotas further emphasizes intentional design. The walls maintain consistent alignment, and the overall proportions suggest a planned ratio. Such precision implies more than practical construction. It reflects conceptual planning, possibly tied to symbolic or administrative purposes. In other ancient contexts, geometric regularity often carries meaning, representing cosmological beliefs or hierarchical organization. At Akiotas, however, no inscriptions or artifacts clarify this intention. The design is visible, but its purpose remains inaccessible, leaving interpretation open and uncertain. At the center of the debate lies the most persistent question: who built Akiotas and why? The leading hypothesis connects the complex to the Umayyad Caliphate, which expanded into Central Asia during the 8th century. Supporters argue that the layout resembles certain Umayyad desert complexes and aligns chronologically with radiocarbon data. If correct, Akiotas may have been intended as an administrative or ceremonial center during a period of rapid expansion. However, this explanation faces serious challenges. Unlike confirmed Umayyad sites, Akiotas lacks inscriptions, decorative elements, and typical architectural features. Its stone construction also differs from the brick-based techniques common in the region at the time. An alternative theory suggests that Akiotas predates the Umayyads and may belong to an earlier, poorly documented culture. This would explain the absence of clear cultural markers, but evidence remains inconclusive. Another possibility is that later groups reused or modified an older structure, complicating attempts to determine its origin. A third perspective proposes that Akiotas was an unfinished project halted by sudden events such as political instability, shifting trade routes, or environmental pressures. Yet there is no clear evidence of destruction or conflict. Instead, the site appears to have been abandoned quietly as if construction simply stopped. This lack of closure is what makes Akiotas unique. Most ancient sites reveal cycles of occupation and decline, leaving behind a narrative that can be reconstructed. Akiotas offers no such sequence. It exists in a suspended state, capturing a moment when intention was never fulfilled. In a broader context, it resembles other unfinished ancient projects, such as incomplete obelisks in Egypt or halted Roman constructions. However, those cases typically include clear explanations for abandonment. At Akiotas, that explanation is missing. The site combines large-scale ambition with a lack of contextual evidence, creating a gap that conventional archaeology struggles to bridge. What do you think Akiotas was truly built for, and what could have caused its sudden abandonment? On the wind-swept coastline of Norfolk, hidden beneath layers of tidal mud for nearly 4,000 years, a structure waited, not built to be seen, not built to last, and perhaps not even built for the living, existing instead as something deliberately concealed within a shifting landscape shaped by water, peat, and time. When it finally emerged in the late 20th century, revealed not through intentional excavation but through the slow erosion of the shoreline, it exposed something deeply unsettling. A perfectly arranged circle of timber posts enclosing a single tree that had been deliberately ripped from the earth and turned upside down, not broken, not burned, but inverted with unmistakable intention, as if the builders were attempting to reverse something fundamental about the natural order itself. What they created is now known as Seahenge, and despite decades of study using modern archaeological science, its true purpose remains unknown, suspended between ritual, symbolism, and a belief system that has not survived into recorded history. Seahenge was not discovered by archaeologists but by chance, when in 1998 a local walker noticed strange wooden stumps emerging from the sands at home next the sea, an area where coastal erosion had stripped away protective layers of sediment that had preserved the site for millennia. As tides continued to shift, more of the structure became visible, revealing a circular arrangement of 55 oak posts forming a ring, approximately 7 meters in diameter, each one carefully placed and oriented inward, creating a boundary that felt enclosed rather than open. At the center stood the remains of a much larger oak trunk positioned unnaturally, with its roots pointing upward toward the sky and its base embedded deep below, indicating that it had been deliberately uprooted and inverted before installation. Excavations in 1999, led by the University of Sheffield in collaboration with English Heritage, were carried out under urgent conditions as archaeologists raced to document and remove the timbers before the sea could destroy them entirely, and what they uncovered would fundamentally reshape understanding of the site. Through dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring growth patterns, researchers established that every timber used in the structure dated to the same narrow seasonal window, the spring of 2049 BCE, a level of chronological precision rarely achieved in prehistoric archaeology. This indicates that the trees were felled within a very short period, transported and shaped rapidly, and assembled as part of a single coordinated effort, meaning that Seahenge was not built gradually over generations but constructed as a deliberate and time-bound event, an organized undertaking carried out with clear intent. As archaeologists dismantled and analyzed the structure, a series of discoveries revealed both the technical capabilities and the limitations of the people who built Seahenge, beginning with the tool marks found on the oak timbers, which showed clean and consistent cuts made using stone or early bronze axes, tools that required considerable effort to shape dense hardwood, yet produced surprisingly precise results. The repetition of these marks across multiple posts suggests not only individual skill, but coordinated labor. implying that the builders worked within a structured system rather than acting independently. The central oak stump remained the most extraordinary element, as it had been excavated, transported, and reinstalled upside down, with much of its root system still intact. A process that would have required careful planning and significant manpower, even by modern standards, where uprooting a mature oak without destroying its structure is a complex and resource-intensive task. Environmental analysis added further context, showing that at the time of construction the site was not a coastal shoreline as it appears today, but part of a wetland or salt marsh environment with soft ground, shallow water, and unstable conditions, and pollen data indicating increasing moisture levels and gradual encroachment of water, suggesting that Seahenge was built within a landscape undergoing environmental change. Yet despite extensive excavation and detailed analysis, no human remains, grave goods, or definitive evidence of burial practices were found within the structure, leaving a significant gap in understanding its function and raising questions about whether it was ever intended to be associated with death in a conventional sense. This is where Seahenge becomes particularly difficult to explain, because everything about its construction appears to challenge the technological expectations of the Bronze Age, requiring the builders to fell over 50 oak trees, transport them across unstable and waterlogged terrain, dig precise post holes in soft ground, arrange them into a near-perfect circular formation, and most remarkably, uproot and invert a massive central tree using only basic tools such as stone axes, wooden levers, and rope. When compared to sites like Stonehenge, where massive stones were transported over long distances but remained upright and structurally straightforward, Seahenge presents a different kind of challenge, one defined not by scale but by complexity and intention. Other prehistoric timber circles exist across Europe, yet none display the same inverted central feature, making Seahenge structurally unique within the archaeological record. The act of inversion itself introduces a significant contradiction, because from a functional perspective it offers no structural advantage and instead creates instability, with irregular roots that are difficult to secure and a base less stable than a flat trunk, suggesting that the decision to invert the tree was symbolic rather than practical. The inward-facing design of the posts reinforces this interpretation, forming a closed, contained space with no clear entrance, a structure that appears designed not for large gatherings but for restricted or controlled use, possibly involving only a small number of participants or a single event. Even more striking is the precision of the circular layout, achieved without evidence of measuring instruments, written plans, or permanent markers, yet still maintaining consistent spacing and alignment, raising important questions about how such spatial accuracy was achieved without formal systems of geometry or recorded knowledge. In attempting to explain Seahenge, researchers have proposed several theories, each addressing different aspects of the structure, but none providing a complete explanation. One interpretation suggests that it functioned as a ritual site associated with death or transformation, where bodies may have been exposed before burial elsewhere, with the inverted tree symbolizing a transition between life and death, or acting as a symbolic axis connecting different realms, though this theory is weakened by the absence of human remains or clear funerary evidence. Another possibility is that the structure reflects cosmological symbolism, drawing on the concept of the world tree or axis mundi, a motif found in various cultures that represents a connection between heaven, earth, and the underworld, with the inversion of the tree possibly indicating a deliberate emphasis on the underworld or a reversal of the natural order, aligning with the enclosed and inward-focused design of the structure. A third theory links Seahenge to environmental stress during the early Bronze Age, when climate shifts led to wetter conditions and rising water levels in parts of Britain, suggesting that the site may have been used for rituals intended to restore balance or influence natural forces, with the inverted tree symbolizing an attempt to counteract or reverse environmental change. Yet perhaps the most unsettling explanation is that Seahenge represents a belief system that has left no trace in later history, with no surviving texts, myths, or cultural continuity to explain its meaning, leaving only the structure itself as evidence of a way of thinking that has been completely lost. Today, the timbers of Seahenge are preserved and studied using modern scientific methods, allowing researchers to determine when it was built, how it was constructed, and even the specific season in which the trees were cut, demonstrating both the precision of prehistoric builders and the capabilities of modern archaeology. If you stood inside Seahenge 4,000 years ago, facing that inverted tree, what do you think it was really used for? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Gold became a symbol of power, and writing marked the beginning of recorded history. But beneath the plains of northeastern Bulgaria lies evidence of something even more fundamental: a settlement built around salt, not as seasoning, but as currency, as survival, as control. Hidden beneath the landscape, Solnitsarta reveals a truth that challenges everything we think we know about early human civilization: that industrial-scale production, economic specialization, and resource-based power structures may have emerged thousands of years earlier than history is willing to admit. This was not a village. This was a system. And systems, once understood, are never simple. The site of Solnitsarta, near the modern town of Provadia, first drew archaeological attention in the early 2000s. Excavations led by Bulgarian archaeologists, including teams from the National Institute of Archaeology, uncovered what initially appeared to be a fortified prehistoric settlement. But as layers were peeled back, the narrative shifted dramatically. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest occupation of the site around 4,700 BCE, pushing it firmly into the Chalcolithic period, well before the rise of Mesopotamian city-states. Yet what lay beneath the soil did not resemble a typical early farming community. Instead, researchers found massive quantities of ceramic vessels, thick-walled furnaces, and mineral residues consistent with brine processing. This was not a place where salt was used. This was a place where salt was made. As excavation seasons progressed, the scale of the operation became clearer. Early digs revealed circular pits lined with clay, interpreted as evaporation basins, followed by the discovery of large ceramic containers capable of holding several liters of brine, often showing signs of repeated heating, thermal stress fractures, mineral crusting, and internal salt deposits. By the mid-2010s, archaeologists had identified entire zones dedicated to salt production, including what appear to be proto-industrial kilns. And these installations were not random but organized spatially and functionally, suggesting a workflow of extraction, heating, evaporation, and collection. In later excavation layers, something even more surprising emerged: stone fortification walls, in some places over 2 meters thick, encircling the settlement, indicating this was not a temporary camp, but a deliberately defended site. And with each discovery, a contradiction deepened. How could a community this early, this small, sustain something this complex? At first glance, the technology of Solnitsarta seems almost primitive, relying on clay vessels, fire and water, heat it long enough and salt remains. A process so basic that it appears intuitive, but when examined closely, the system begins to unravel into something far more sophisticated. because to produce salt efficiently through boiling, several variables must be controlled with surprising precision, including temperature stability, where too low slows evaporation, and too high risks, cracking vessels or uneven boiling, volume calibration, where the ratio of brine to container size determines yield and consistency, time cycles, requiring repeated heating sequences that must be maintained to ensure continuous output, and material resilience, as ceramics must endure repeated thermal stress without failure. What archaeologists found at Solnitsarta suggests these variables were not merely understood but optimized, as many ceramic vessels display uniform dimensions implying standardization. Residue analysis reveals consistent salinity levels, suggesting controlled input sources, and some kilns appear to have been used continuously over extended periods, indicating sustained and organized production cycles. This is where the paradox emerges, because there is no evidence of formal mathematics, no written instructions, and no measuring tools as we would recognize them, and yet the output behaves as if governed by repeatable, calibrated processes. To understand this anomaly, it helps to compare Solnitsarta with sites like Dolny Viestonice, dating back to around 29,000 BCE, where archaeologists discovered ceramic kilns capable of firing clay at temperatures exceeding 600 to 800 degrees Celsius long before metallurgy, demonstrating early mastery of thermal control. But Solnitsarta goes further by not only controlling heat, but integrating it into a structured production system. Even in later civilizations, such as ancient China during the first millennium BCE, large-scale salt production required state-level organization, written records, and specialized labor, yet at Solnitsarta, all of this appears to exist without visible state infrastructure, raising a deeper question, not whether the technology was simple, but how something so simple was used with such systematic precision long before systems were supposed to exist. The implications of this production extend far beyond technology, as salt in prehistoric Europe was not merely valuable, but essential for preserving meat, sustaining diets, and enabling long-term storage, meaning control over salt equated to control over survival itself. And near Solnitsarta lies the Varna necropolis, dated to roughly the same period and famous for containing the oldest known worked gold in the world, with some graves holding astonishing quantities of gold artifacts far exceeding what would be expected in a small regional culture, making the connection difficult to ignore. One plausible theory is that Solnitsarta functioned as a primary economic engine, producing salt that could be traded across vast distances, generating wealth that eventually accumulated in places like Varna, suggesting that gold may not have been the origin of wealth, but rather its consequence. And if this interpretation holds true, Solnitsarta could represent one of the earliest examples of a resource-driven economy predating formal currency systems by millennia. The presence of massive stone walls introduces another layer of mystery, as fortifications of this scale are rare in settlements of this age, especially those with relatively small populations, raising the question of why a salt production site would require such heavy defense. With the most obvious answer being value, since if salt was as important as evidence suggests, Solnitsarta would have been a strategic target, yet the scale of defense implies either constant threat or exceptional importance beyond simple resource protection. When compared to early fortified sites like Jericho, which also built defensive walls but within the context of large, permanent populations, Solnitsarta stands apart as a specialized hub rather than a sprawling urban center, suggesting it was defended not because it was large, but because it was critical. By the end of the 5th millennium BCE, Solnitsarta was abandoned, and there is no clear evidence of destruction, no widespread burn layers, and no mass graves indicating violent conflict. As production ceases, occupation ends, and the system dissolves, leaving only unanswered questions about whether environmental changes, such as shifts in groundwater, salinity, or climate conditions affecting evaporation, may have played a role, or whether the trade networks that sustained the settlement collapsed, rendering the entire operation obsolete. But despite these possibilities, there are no definitive answers, only the silence left behind by a system that once functioned with remarkable precision. If a system this advanced could exist so early in human history, what do you think we've lost that we still haven't rediscovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Buried beneath a low, unremarkable mound in northeastern Bulgaria, a chamber carved more than 2,000 years ago challenges one of the oldest assumptions in archaeology, that tombs are built for the dead. Inside the Sveshtari tomb, 10 sculpted women appear to float along the walls, their bodies curved in unnatural poses, their arms raised not to support the ceiling in any structural sense, but as if lifting something invisible upward. The geometry is precise, the symbolism deliberate, and yet the function remains unclear, creating a contradiction that has persisted since its discovery. This is not simply a burial chamber, but a system designed with intent beyond death itself. The tomb was discovered in 1982 during archaeological excavations in the Sporianovo Archaeological Reserve, a vast landscape containing more than 100 Thracian burial mounds, most of which follow predictable architectural patterns involving simple corridors and modest chambers. At first glance, the mound concealing Sveshtari appeared indistinguishable from the others, rounded, silent, and untouched for over 2 millennia. But as excavation progressed, researchers uncovered a far more complex structure composed of a long dromos leading into sequential chambers and culminating in a central vaulted space of unusual proportions. What immediately distinguished this chamber was not just its layout, but the presence of 10 caryatid figures arranged with striking regularity, a feature completely unprecedented in Thracian archaeology, suggesting either external influence or a localized tradition that has otherwise vanished from the historical record. Initial structural mapping revealed that the chamber was not constructed randomly, but followed a consistent geometric logic, with the curvature of the vault, the spacing between sculptural elements, and the alignment of decorative motifs all adhering to proportional relationships that imply deliberate planning rather than intuitive construction. However, this precision was not accompanied by any evidence of advanced measuring systems, such as calibrated tools, marked grids, or metal frameworks, raising immediate questions about how such accuracy was achieved. As excavation continued into detailed artistic analysis, archaeologists observed that the 10 caryatids shared nearly identical proportions, each carved to a consistent height and positioned symmetrically along the walls. While subtle differences in posture created the illusion of movement, an artistic sophistication rarely associated with Thracian craftsmanship. When compared to Greek caryatids, such as those of the Erechtheion, which visibly support structural loads, the figures at Sveshtari appear detached from functional necessity, reinforcing the idea that their purpose is symbolic rather than architectural. Further contextual analysis complicated the picture even more, as the tomb yielded surprisingly few artifacts relative to its scale. Unlike Egyptian or Macedonian royal burials, where inscriptions, regalia, and grave goods clearly establish identity and status, Sveshtari provided no definitive inscription and only limited material evidence, leaving the identity of its occupant uncertain and suggesting that the structure's purpose may not have been centered on burial in the conventional sense. At the heart of the Sveshtari tomb lies a technological contradiction, that challenges established assumptions about Thracian capabilities, as the culture is not historically associated with the kind of advanced stoneworking seen in Egyptian or classical Greek architecture, where precise geometry and refined carving techniques are well documented. And yet, within this chamber, the ceiling features a rosette motif executed with near-perfect radial symmetry. The spacing between the 10 caryatids follows consistent intervals, suggesting controlled measurement, and the curvature of the vaulted ceiling distributes weight evenly, despite the absence of visible reinforcement or structural redundancy. In experimental archaeology, attempts to replicate such symmetry in limestone using only primitive tools typically result in measurable deviations, often in the range of 1 to 2 millimeters per segment, which accumulate across circular designs and produce visible distortions. However, in Sveshtari, such distortions are almost entirely absent, indicating a level of precision that implies either highly refined techniques or a method of measurement that has not been preserved. When compared to other Thracian tombs, which generally exhibit less geometric control and simpler decorative schemes, Sveshtari stands as an anomaly, while comparisons to Greek and Macedonian structures raise further questions, as those cultures possessed well-documented toolkits and engineering traditions that the Thracians did not clearly share. Several explanations have been proposed, including the possibility of imported knowledge from Hellenistic artisans, the existence of lost local techniques developed over generations, or the prioritization of symbolic precision over structural necessity. But none fully account for the consistency observed across multiple architectural and decorative elements within the chamber, suggesting that what is present here is not isolated craftsmanship, but a coherent system of precision embedded within the design itself. Among the most compelling elements of the tomb is a relief depicting a mounted figure, often interpreted as a Thracian ruler or hero, surrounded by symbolic forms that suggest elevation rather than burial, a depiction that diverges significantly from traditional funerary imagery focused on interment or mourning. This scene, combined with the upward gestures of the 10 female figures, reinforces a thematic emphasis on ascent and transformation, aligning with certain interpretations of Thracian belief systems, in which death is not viewed as an endpoint, but as a transition to a higher state of existence. In this context, the architecture of the tomb can be understood not merely as a container for the dead, but as a structured environment designed to represent or facilitate a metaphysical process, where spatial arrangement, sculptural symbolism, and geometric precision collectively encode a narrative of transformation rather than finality. Despite decades of research, the identity of the individual associated with the Sveshtari tomb remains unresolved, with no inscriptions, definitive royal markers, or burial inventories sufficient to confirm ownership, an absence that stands in stark contrast to other ancient burial traditions where identity is clearly emphasized. While some scholars have suggested a connection to the Thracian ruler Dromicates, who lived in the 3rd century BCE, the evidence remains circumstantial, and the scale of the structure appears disproportionate to the limited material evidence found within it. This discrepancy raises the possibility that the tomb was not constructed primarily to commemorate an individual, but to serve a broader ritual or symbolic function, in which personal identity was secondary or even irrelevant. Within the Sporionovo Reserve, more than 100 burial mounds have been documented, yet none replicate the architectural complexity or symbolic program observed in Sveshtari, creating a significant anomaly within the archaeological record. If the design reflects a broader cultural practice, its absence elsewhere is difficult to explain, while if it represents a unique experiment or localized tradition, Its sophistication raises questions about why it was not repeated or further developed. Archaeology typically relies on patterns to establish cultural norms and technological progression, but in the case of Sveshtari, the lack of comparable structures leaves researchers without a framework for interpretation, reinforcing the idea that this site occupies a category of its own. So what do you think this structure really was, just an unusual tomb, or something far more advanced like a ritual system designed to transform the soul? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Perfect circles are rare in nature. They appear in planetary craters, in ripples on water, in controlled experiments, but almost never in large-scale human construction without a clear functional need. Yet in the high Andes of Peru, carved into the earth with deliberate precision, lies a structure composed of concentric rings descending deep into the ground. It looks engineered, calculated, and controlled. The problem is not what it is. The problem is that its design appears to solve a problem we do not fully understand. Moray does not behave like a farm. It behaves like a system. Unlike monumental sites that dominate the horizon, Moray remained largely unrecognized until the 20th century, when aerial observation revealed its full geometry. From ground level, the terraces appear fragmented, irregular, and partially collapsed. But from above, the pattern becomes undeniable. Multiple circular depressions, each composed of near-perfect concentric terraces, descending up to approximately 30 meters in depth and spanning over 100 meters in diameter. This shift in perspective changed everything. What seemed like agricultural terraces became something else entirely, a geometric construct embedded into the landscape rather than adapted to it. Early archaeological surveys identified the site as part of the broader infrastructure of the Inca Empire, yet its function remained unclear from the outset. Initial excavations focused on structural composition rather than artifacts, and this is where Moray began to diverge from expectations. Unlike typical Andean terraces, which rely heavily on local soil, Moray revealed a deliberate layering system consisting of a base of large stones for drainage, intermediate layers of gravel and sand, and upper layers of fertile soil often transported from different ecological zones. Soil analysis indicated that the upper layers were not native to the immediate area, but were likely sourced from multiple regions, suggesting intentional variation in composition rather than random distribution. Further studies identified advanced drainage channels capable of preventing water accumulation even during heavy rainfall. Despite its depth and enclosed structure, Moray does not flood. Instead, water disperses efficiently through the layered substrate, behaving more like a modern engineered system than a primitive agricultural field. No significant domestic artifacts, no tools, no housing remains, no storage facilities were found, in quantities that would suggest continuous large-scale farming activity, and this absence is as important as the physical evidence itself. In most ancient agricultural systems, efficiency dictates form. Terraces follow slopes, maximize sunlight, and reduce erosion. Moray violates this principle entirely. It does not follow the natural contour of the land, it imposes a geometry onto it. The terraces are arranged in near-perfect circles, a design that requires additional labor without obvious agricultural benefit. Circular terraces do not maximize planting area compared to linear ones. They complicate irrigation patterns, and they increase construction difficulty. Yet they exist here in a form that is too precise to be accidental. This introduces a fundamental contradiction. If the goal was farming, the design is unnecessarily complex. If the goal was something else, then what exactly was being optimized? This is where Moray shifts from unusual to deeply anomalous. Measurements taken across different terrace levels have demonstrated consistent temperature gradients between the top and the bottom of the depressions, with differences reaching up to 10 to 15 degrees Celsius depending on season and time of day. Each level effectively creates a distinct microclimate, where upper terraces are cooler and more exposed to wind, mid-level terraces maintain moderated temperature and humidity, and lower terraces remain warmer and more stable with reduced airflow. The circular structure amplifies this effect. Cold air sinks and becomes trapped, while solar radiation heats the inner walls, creating a vertical stratification of environmental conditions. Wind patterns are disrupted, reducing variability and allowing each level to maintain relatively stable conditions compared to the surrounding landscape. This leads to a hypothesis supported by multiple agricultural scientists that Moray functioned as a controlled experimental environment. Instead of cultivating crops for immediate consumption, it may have been used to test crop resilience across altitude-equivalent conditions, simulate different ecological zones within a confined space, and select or adapt plant varieties for diverse climates across the Andes. In modern terms, this resembles a research facility, a biological testing system designed to study environmental response. The implication is significant. To intentionally design such a system, the builders would need empirical knowledge of temperature variation with altitude, an understanding of airflow and heat retention, and the ability to replicate environmental conditions artificially. There is no written record confirming this level of environmental science in the Inca world, yet the physical evidence suggests controlled experimentation at scale. To understand Moray, it must be compared with other ancient agricultural innovations. The Chinampas system of the Aztecs maximized productivity through floating fields, optimizing water access and soil fertility, while the rice terraces of Philippines follow mountainous terrain, reducing erosion while maintaining irrigation efficiency. Both systems are adaptive. They respond directly to environmental constraints. Moray does not adapt. It constructs an artificial environment. This distinction is critical because it suggests a shift from survival-based agriculture to knowledge-based experimentation. Despite decades of study, several key questions remain unanswered. Why construct deep circular depressions instead of surface-level terraces? Why import diverse soil types rather than utilize local resources? Why create multiple microclimates in a single location? Why is there a lack of evidence for large-scale food production or storage? Perhaps most importantly, why is Moray unique? No other site within the Inca network replicates this exact configuration at comparable scale and precision, and if it were a successful agricultural method, it should have been duplicated, but it was not. If an ancient civilization could engineer controlled environments to test and adapt life itself, then how many other structures we call agriculture were actually something far more deliberate, and how much of that intention have we already lost?